Battle of Islam and Capitalism by Sayyid Qutb. Translation by Muhammad Al-Amrani. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. The cry of warning. This miserable social condition afflicting the masses in Egypt is unsustainable. It cannot endure. This is a truth that must be recognized by all, for only by acknowledging it can we tread the right path toward rectification. Indeed, it is untenable, for it stands in defiance of the very nature of things. It lacks even a single element that might ensure its survival, nor does it possess within itself the seeds of endurance. It is granted a temporary reprieve, an illusion of stability, but this cannot last. It is an affront to every meaning of human civilization. It is opposed to the spirit of religion in every interpretation of its essence. It contradicts the very demands of our time in all its imperatives. And beyond all this, it violates the most fundamental principles of sound economics. It is, therefore, not merely an obstacle to economic growth, but a hindrance to social and human progress itself. Any social order that cripples a nation's ability to labour and produce, and in doing so impedes its advancement and growth, is an aberration, one that not only forfeits its right to endure, but that is, in truth, incapable of enduring. How much more so when such an order also tramples upon human dignity, corrupts morality and conscience, annihilates every semblance of justice, erodes the essential trust between the people and the state, spreads unrest and extinguishes the sense of security. Those who cling today to this aberrant system and strive to uphold it, whether they be exploiters who resent any contribution to the collective burdens necessary for the establishment and preservation of a just society, or tyrants who cannot bear to see justice take its course, lest it deprive them of their baseless dominion, or the decadent, accustomed to a life of unrestrained indulgence, who recoil at the thought of moderation and restraint, or the so-called religious authorities who have sold their souls not to God nor to the nation, but to the devil, and to those who would barter for them a paltry price. These all strive against the very nature of things. They cast themselves into ruin, for they squander every remaining opportunity for salvation. Would that they alone were doomed in their downfall, but alas, they drag down with them these afflicted nations, unless these nations rise to seize them by the hand, while time yet remains before the decree is irrevocably sealed, before the final warning is fulfilled. And when we desire to destroy a town, we command its opulent ones, and they transgress therein. Thus the word is justified against it, and we annihilate it utterly. Quran 17:16. The grim realities that confront us today cannot be remedied by moral exhortations or cunning legalistic decrees, nor can they be silenced by gagging mouths and shattering pens. They can only be met with real solutions, tangible and just. Hollow stomachs do not comprehend logic, even if that logic be sound, free of deceit and distortion. This we must grasp before it is too late. And by God, the hour of reckoning is nearly upon us. Let those who wish to speak as they will let the exploiters and tyrants, the mercenary clerics, the hired scribes, and the paid propagandists declare. Those who call for the rectification of this corrupt social order are communists. They are outlaws. They are a threat to security and stability. They are agents of destruction and chaos. Let them wage war against these voices with the infernal means that tyrants have wielded in every age and place. Let them cast them into prisons and dungeons, silence their presses and cripple their livelihoods, erase them from public memory. Yet, after all this, a voice shall still rise, one they cannot silence. It is the voice of empty stomachs, echoing through the length and breadth of this valley. It is the voice of millions who sweat and bleed, yet cannot earn so much as a crust of dry bread or a tattered garment to shield them from the cold. It is the voice of multitudes who have never read a single word about communism or any other ideology, but who are nonetheless living beings whose stomachs demand food, whose skins cry out for clothing. And in the end, one voice shall remain, even if all others are silenced, the voice of reality itself, speaking with the tongues of millions of shattered, degraded human beings, whom this unjust social system has so utterly crushed that it has robbed them even of the ability to feel their own oppression, to recognize their own deprivation. Yes, and the voice of the hundreds of thousands of human wrecks scattered in the streets, clinging to walls, scavenging in garbage bins alongside stray cats and dogs, their bodies deformed, their skins ulcerated, their eyes hollow, their gazes furtive and suspicious, or else submissive and begging here and there in every corner of the land. All this while debauchery and lewd extravagance revel in palaces and brothels, and the gold, wrung from the blood of millions, is squandered upon lavish feasts and in the embrace of harlots, while obscene profits accumulate beyond the capacity of their owners to count, let alone to spend. Who dares to claim that such a social order, yielding such vile and putrid fruits, can endure no matter how many artificial supports are erected beneath it, whether in the form of clerical decrees sold by professional preachers, or the writings of venal journalists, or the brutal force of tyrants and exploiters? It is an illusion, a futile delusion, a defiance of the natural order. I accuse this present social order of paralyzing the nation's capacity for labor and production, of spreading unemployment and idleness, of rendering it incapable of harnessing its natural and human resources, of weakening it in the face of both internal and external dangers that grow ever more ominous with the passing of days. Our land is capable of yielding many times its current produce, but why does it not? Because it remains divided as it was in the darkest days of feudalism, monopolized in the hands of a privileged few who neither exploit it fully nor relinquish it to those who could. Let this land be freed from such monopolization. Let it pass into the hands of the toiling masses who are ready to cultivate it. Then, and only then, will the condition of the people be transformed, and our arable land could be multiplied. But why does this not happen? Because major irrigation and drainage projects remain stalled, unimplemented. And why? Because they require funds, and the wealth of the nation lies in the hands of capitalists, while the state hesitates to impose upon them their rightful share of the burden. And why does the state hesitate? Because it does not represent the impoverished masses, it represents the interests of capital. Let the reins of governance truly pass to the people. Then the nation will find in its coffers, through just taxation, the means to reclaim its barren lands and bring them to life within a reasonable span of years. This land holds within it vast untapped resources, raw materials and latent energies left unexploited. Why? Because the state is poor, powerless, insincere and distracted. Poor because its treasury depends on customs revenues paid by the poor before the rich, rather than on direct taxes that the rich should bear before the poor. Powerless because its administrative apparatus is corrupt, ruined by favoritism, nepotism, inefficiency and bureaucratic stagnation, even more than by bribery and moral decay. Insincere because it feels no urgency to increase the collective wealth of the nation, so long as those in power wallow in surplus, unable even to expend their boundless riches. And distracted by the petty partisan squabbles in the arena of political dwarfs, an arena set up by colonialism a quarter of a century ago in the name of constitutionalism, while it stood by amused, like the nobles of the Middle Ages watching gladiators and slaves fight for sport. And distracted by its efforts to uphold this perverse social order, one that defies the very nature of things, and that demands an enormous exertion from an already crippled and corrupt government machinery merely to sustain its existence. And indeed, upon this very earth lie treasures of human potential, and forces of intellect no less abundant than its raw materials and natural wealth. Yet no one seeks to harness them, nor does anyone turn their attention to them. Why? Because the immediate interests of the capitalist lords whom the state represents do not require the cultivation of these forces, nor their rescue from idleness and ruin. And so they are left to ignorance, disease and poverty, which consume them like a devouring flame. Left to idleness, which renders them into trivial beings, either wandering aimlessly through the streets, or seated in cafes and taverns, or working as if unemployed, producing nothing but the most meagre, insignificant output, for the system under which they labour is corrupt. Their wages offer no incentive for dedication, and the future that awaits them is darkness upon darkness. The state makes no true effort to salvage these squandered and wasted riches, lost in folly and extravagance, for to reclaim this national wealth of human potential would require an investment of capital, an expenditure that the state hesitates before, silent and paralysed, overcome with timidity and fear. And so, the great wheel of labour turns in both state and nation not to meet the needs of all its inhabitants, but merely to serve the narrow interests of a small handful who alone possess the means of production and consumption. Neither the state nor the nation act to safeguard the vast interests of 20 million souls, but instead they protect only the limited interests of a select and privileged few. Meanwhile, the population grows, and the nation's yield diminishes, not due to any inherent inability of the people to work, nor due to a lack of natural talent or aptitude, but as a consequence of this profound imbalance in the distribution of national wealth, of gains and burdens alike. And thus we fall behind while the world races forward. We grow weak while our adversaries, standing at our very gates, grow ever more capable of aggression. Our stature among nations declines with each passing day, while we stand idly by, shouting and clamouring in empty partisan squabbles within an arena of dwarfs, crying out, "Long live and down with!" as though these cries could alter the course of fate. I accuse the existing social order of violating human dignity and destroying every vestige of human rights. Who dares claim that these millions of starving, naked, barefoot peasants, whose very bowels are consumed by worms, whose eyes are gnawed by flies, whose blood is drained by insects, are human beings, enjoying the dignity and rights of man? Who dares claim that those young boys, herded from villages and hamlets into the forced labour of seasonal migration, clearing the fields of pests in the vast estates and plantations, while their own bodies crawl with affliction, transported across tens and even hundreds of miles from their families, to return or never return, neither as volunteers nor as free men, but as captives, compelled and coerced in exchange for mere pennies and morsels, half of which are stolen before they even reach their frail, trembling hands? Who dares claim that these children possess the dignity and rights of man? Who dares claim that the countless thousands of labourers toiling in the feudal domains are truly human beings, when the feudal lord holds in his hands the power of life and death, of giving and withholding, of granting sustenance or meting out suffering, while the labourers possess nothing, not even the right to remain upon the land they till, nor the faintest form of recompense upon being cast out? If the master or even his steward grows displeased, the labourer is expelled, along with his wife and children. His meagre cow is confiscated. His humble hut, once granted by the master's favour, is taken back, and he is cast out a wanderer, a fugitive, abandoned by the mercy of all the earth. Who dares claim that the hundreds of thousands of beggars, the crippled and destitute, scavenging for scraps in garbage heaps, naked in body, barefoot in step, their faces caked in dust, their eyes vacant and lost, who dares claim that these are human beings endowed with dignity and human rights, when even the master's dogs in the palaces of the affluent fare better than they? Who dares claim that the thousands of domestic servants, the wandering servants in government offices who are denied by law even the right to form their own unions because their masters refuse them this right, lest the slaves dare challenge the lords, lest they presume to possess rights even if only theoretical, by which they might raise their heads in defiance? Who dares claim that these are human beings, entitled to the dignity and rights of man? And let us set aside, then, that absurd myth which proclaims the nation is the source of authority, and speaks of the right to vote and the freedom of choice. What a hollow fiction, a falsehood unworthy of debate. For this so-called nation, the supposed source of authority, is none other than these millions haggard, famished, destitute, deceived. These millions who spend their days and nights in ceaseless pursuit of a mere morsel of bread. These millions who can scarcely lift their heads for a moment to consider the luxury of what they call elections and the freedom of choice. These millions who move at the mere gesture of their masters, voting when commanded, abstaining when forbidden, for these masters are the gatekeepers of their livelihoods, the landlords of the estates that shelter their hunger. It is a cruel joke to speak of constitutions and parliaments under the rule of feudalism, For we live beneath feudalism in its full and unmitigated form, lacking only a single element, the feudal lord's obligations toward his serfs. In the past, the master bore responsibility for his slaves. He arranged their daughters' marriages, provided them with alms, tended to their illnesses, and covered the costs of burials and feasts. But the era of constitutions has absolved him of all these burdens, leaving him only with the bodies of his slaves, free to consume them as he pleases, however he pleases. To speak of constitutions and parliaments in such an age is mere jest, an amusement for the idle. But it is not the discourse of a nation that seeks earnestness, nor of a people who gaze upon reality with solemn reflection. I accuse the existing social order of corrupting morality and conscience, of spreading vice throughout society and the state, of leading both individual and nation toward decay. For when wealth swells upon one side, while deprivation festers upon the other, it inevitably breeds a class of idle, decadent elites, endowed with an excess of money, an excess of time, and an excess of physical energy that demands an outlet. And when energy is not spent in labour, nor guided by an ideal beyond the self, it must find another path, one of coarse physical pleasure, of extravagant indulgence, of lavish feasts and reckless pursuits, of drunken revelry, of heedless debauchery. What else can those youthful scions, those bloated elders do, to whom the fruits of toil, sweat and blood are delivered without effort? What else can they do when labour has not purified their hands or their hearts, when toil has not occupied their minds or their souls? What else remains but to drown in sensual pleasures, in base appetites, in the soft and vulgar luxuries of excess? And they wield the power of temptation, the power of wealth. On the other shore stand the deprived, the wretched, weak against such allure, seeking life, seeking pleasure, yet finding no honourable path to either. For honour in Egypt is the last profession that offers one nothing more than mere subsistence. Thus the destitute and the desperate divide into two groups, the brokers and the victims, the procurers and the enslaved. As for the third group, the honourable ones who refuse to yield to temptation, they are but a handful, those who desire neither life nor pleasure, or they are the heroes and saints. And not all men, nor even most, are heroes or saints. And so there must be a retinue, a train of flatterers to fawn upon the whims of these idle lords, and they shall find them among the human wreckage which this corrupt society has reduced to mere parasites and sycophants, on the corruption of society and the illusion of justice. And thus a vicious circle is formed of idle youth and stagnant old age, of white slavery and sordid trafficking, of servile flattery, the annihilation of personal dignity and moral decay. Let us turn away from this stagnant pool, only to find ourselves gazing upon another one that is active, bustling, and ever in motion, yet still within the domain of the devil, the realm of bribery and corruption, of theft and embezzlement, of the erosion of conscience. Here it is poverty on one side and temptation on the other. Here stands the man with a family to feed, his back flayed by the merciless whips of inflation, his very lifeblood drained to fill the coffers of wealthy financiers, those whom the state itself protects with its legislation, working solely in their interests, not in the interests of the people. He is a frail creature, and before him lies the lure of illicit wealth, the kind of wealth that multiplies through fraud and theft, through smuggling and hoarding. Yet it is not always poverty that stands before wealth. Oftentimes it is wealth that stands against wealth. It is the mutual interest of the exceedingly rich against the exceedingly rich, a conspiracy against the rights of the people, against the well-being of the masses. The masses, weak and powerless, who possess nothing with which to defend themselves in this battle, not even the strength of awareness and vigilance. And here we find the cases of spoiled ammunition sold to the army, of food supplies smuggled to Israel, of embezzlement in public funds. These are crimes so hideous, so repugnant, that the very soul recoils in horror. Yet at their core they are not separate from the wider social order. Rather, they are its natural and inevitable offspring. For how can the scales of social justice be so utterly corrupted, and yet morality and principles remain intact? No. This is the filth of a stagnant swamp, into which more filth and refuse are poured, where insects breed upon its banks, and worms fester within its depths until in time it grows ever wider, ever deeper, until it engulfs the entire society, transforming it into a vast putrid mire in which conscience and ethics drown, where nations and homelands themselves are swallowed whole. The silence of the scholars. And now, behold the revered gentlemen of the Council of Senior Scholars, roused from their deep and prolonged slumber, lamenting the decay of morals and the spread of vice, crying out not merely a single lamentation, but many. Very well, then let us turn to these revered gentlemen for a moment, to listen to their solemn admonition as a respite from the grim reality we endure. This is but an excerpt from their petition to the Prime Minister on one occasion. Whoever gazes upon the condition of our beloved nation, upon the state of its faith and morality, cannot but be stricken with horror at what he beholds, overcome with grief for its present state, and filled with dread for what its future may hold. For the people have taken lightly the commands and prohibitions of religion, they have inclined toward that which is contrary to the traditions of Islam, and they have succumbed to influences of licentiousness and moral dissolution, heedlessly chasing after a false civilization, beguiled by its deceptive glitter. The forces of corruption and temptation have multiplied in the land, particularly targeting the young generation, the very ones upon whom the nation relies for its progress and resurgence. From depraved revelries, in which men and women mingle with reckless abandon, where wine flows freely, and deeds are committed that defy all standards of decency and virtue, to gambling halls, where gold is squandered upon tables, where fortunes are lost and homes are ruined, to racing tracks and betting arenas, breeding grounds for vice and the squandering of wealth, to beauty contests, which are but exhibitions of debauchery and sin, where acts are committed that make religion, morality and human dignity recoil in shame, to summer resorts, where restraint is cast aside and wickedness prevails, to newspapers and media, which recount and publicize such tales, inflaming passions and desires without regard for modesty or restraint, to countless other manifestations of immorality and transgression. Oh, is it thus, O revered scholars? Glory be to God, and there is no power nor might save in him. Indeed, this is a grave matter, one that calls for divine wrath and invites divine punishment. But since your esteemed tongues have at last spoken out about the state of society, was there not one single word to be said about the rampant social injustices? About Islam's stance on governance, on wealth, on the intolerable inequalities that plague society? And what, O revered scholars, did you expect from the existing social order, if not precisely this corruption which your noble sermon has merely skimmed the surface of, while carefully avoiding its deeper causes? The very system that you defend and uphold, the very system that you dare not criticize, not even in passing, not even with the faintest whisper for silence in this matter, is gold, pure gold. The accusation, I accuse the existing social system of turning equal opportunity into a myth, of making justice between labour and reward a mere legend. In doing so, it sows anxiety and turmoil in the hearts of individuals and communities alike. For in this land, a child needs only to choose his parents wisely, and all doors shall open before him, every obstacle shall melt away. But woe unto the one who fails in this choice. His only hope, then, is to marry a woman who has chosen her parents well, one born into the house of a minister or a nobleman, so that she may lift him upon her wings and take flight. And if he fails even in this choice, then perhaps he may still rely upon his features and appearance, for these too hold the power to unlock doors and grant passage among those in power. Just as the sorcerers of old spoke of charms and incantations to break spells, so too does beauty serve as an enchantment in our own time, an amulet that grants access to rulers and officials alike. And what of the jest uttered by the inspired poet Mahmud Abu al-Wafa in his verses from Burning Breaths? My brother, tell me, and do not be ashamed, how did you rise to such heights? You are neither of noble birth, nor have you ever taken a wife. This was no mere jest, but a flash of truth illuminating in an instant the dark reality of a diseased social order spoken through the lips of a poet whose heart was sincere and whose vision was unclouded. The illusion of equal opportunity, Equal opportunity in such a society is a myth no less absurd than the myth of equality before the law. For what equality exists between the child born into a hovel, cast upon the dirt, or upon some filth-ridden stone, left to the mercy of disease and hunger only to struggle against deprivation and neglect, and after overcoming all this, to be met with further hardship and rejection? And his sister born instead into the hands of a physician, cradled by a nurse, sheltered by care and affection, nurtured with tenderness and indulgence, then sent to kindergarten, then to university, then placed upon a bureaucratic throne or ushered into the corridors of wealth and power. What equality exists between the one who chose his parents wisely but failed in his studies and the one who was denied such choice yet excelled in learning? What justice exists in employment or in the so-called free market when one man strides forth with family and influence clearing his path, while another is met with obstacles and hardships at every step of his long and arduous journey? And if equal opportunity is a myth, then justice between labour and reward is nothing but a fantasy. For who dares claim that the millions who hunger in this land do so because they are lazy, unwilling to work? No, it is those who labour with honour who are the ones that hunger, while those who steal, deceive and exploit rise to wealth and prominence overnight. We do not deny the disparities in individual preparedness and innate abilities, yet what disparity can ever justify the chasm between the millions of Abbas, Farghali, Amin Yahya, al-Badrawi and their likes, and the meagre wages received by their labourers, their servants, and the peasants who toil under them? And what disparity can justify the gulf between the salary of a minister, a deputy minister, or a general director, and the wages of clerks, couriers and janitors in government offices, wages that, in some cases, amount to but a 50th of the former? Any sophistry about differences in individual abilities stands abashed and ashamed before the glaring reality, a reality so stark that even its defenders fail to justify or explain it, just as it itself fails to sustain its own existence, for it runs counter to the very nature of things. A society such as this breeds anxiety in the hearts of its people, both individually and collectively, an anxiety born of the knowledge that effort does not meet with just reward, that diligence is not recompensed, that crooked paths lead farther than straight ones, and that simply being born into the household of a minister or a magnate avails a man more than intelligence, talent, integrity, and hard work combined. More than a quarter of a century has passed since Egypt took its destiny into its own hands, and successive ministries and political parties have held the reins of power. Yet not a single era among them has been free from that loathsome practice of favouritism, sometimes in ones and tens, sometimes in hundreds and thousands, until it became common knowledge in government offices and on the lips of the people that nepotism is the only swift and certain road to success. And it became entrenched in their conscience that nothing compares to the advantage of being well connected, of having influential patrons, or of treading, by any means necessary, a path that is anything but upright. And when people lose their faith in goodness, duty, integrity and conscience, then all things decay and anxiety and suspicion take root and negligence and recklessness spread unchecked. And so we have arrived at this point, and with it we have arrived at something graver still, the absolute doubt in the competence of Egypt's administration and a wistful longing for the days of colonial rule, an utter catastrophe. For what is more perilous than when a citizen loses faith in his own country, his own people, and even himself? This is the crime committed by the policy of favouritism, the crime of shaking the people's trust in national rule, the crime of eroding the inner conviction in the value of independence and in the necessity of independence. I accuse the prevailing social order of driving the people by compulsion and necessity into the embrace of communism, especially the innocent youth of the rising generation. When millions of the downtrodden, who barely find sustenance, are told that communism guarantees them sufficiency, that it will put an end to the obscene extravagance of the wealthy, its words work like magic upon the hearts of the masses. And when they are told that communism will deprive them of the freedom to work, to speak and to think, they scarcely feel that it is robbing them of anything real that they already possess. Communism in itself holds no mystery, no secret. But for the masses it finds resonance in the bitter wisdom of their own proverbs. They struck the one-eyed man in his blind eye, and he said, "Lost for lost." Or that other saying, they told the monkey, "God will curse you." He replied, "Will he turn me into a gazelle?" For the one-eyed and the monkeys, that is, those who own nothing, those who despair that any fate could be worse than their present one, these are the ones whom communism enchants. For any change might benefit them, and in any case it could not possibly harm them further. As for those who possess something, who possess freedom of speech and thought, and above all, the freedom of bread itself, those who are not tormented by these vast social inequalities, they are the natural enemies of communism. This is why communism has yet to find fertile soil in Sweden, Norway or Denmark, not because the people of these lands hold a loftier view of life than the communists, nor because they are driven by any higher spiritual or humanitarian ideals, but simply because they already have more than communism can offer, and would lose by embracing it real privileges they already possess. When a worker in these countries is told communism will guarantee you sufficiency and security in life, he might scoff, for his sufficiency is already assured, as is his very comfort. And when he is told communism will guarantee you permanent employment and protect you from the perils of unemployment, he may laugh, for his livelihood is secure whether employed or unemployed. He does not live in fear of such uncertainties. But when he is told, communism will conscript you into labour without freedom or choice, it will strip you of your right to unionize, it will suppress your freedom of speech, of writing, of thought, then he is seized with dread, for these are freedoms he tangibly enjoys, not merely in books and constitutions, but as concrete realities in his daily life. At that moment, communism finds itself powerless to sway his heart, for it offers him nothing he lacks, while taking from him real liberties he cherishes. So too in America. The American worker knows that when the miners declared a strike and President Truman spoke of taking severe measures to end it, the workers shouted, "Let Truman come here and dig the earth with us." And this cry was published in newspapers, in bold letters on front pages, and not a single policeman moved to arrest a worker, let alone beat him, imprison him, or torture him. And when a long-tongued journalist wrote vilely about Truman's daughter, the most the president of a nation that rules half the world did was to write him a personal letter, saying, "I will strike you myself when I meet you." And no Gestapo was dispatched to break the journalist's neck or to kill him in secret and cast his body into a pit. And the American worker knows that in Russia no man dares cry out against Stalin nor write a single word about his family. And thus he recoils in terror from communism. But here Abud Pasha may crush the unions of his workers if they dare commit the crime of demanding that he implement a state law that grants them a few extra morsels in the name of a cost-of-living allowance while the state stands by, watching, even encouraging him as he crushes them ruthlessly. And the Agricultural Association may dismiss an employee who has served it for 17 years, just as his father had served before him, merely for demanding the same allowance. As for freedom of speech and thought, let the political police answer for it. Let the prisons and detention camps bear witness. Let the annals of every political case in modern Egypt tell the tale of torture and repression. Communism in itself is a petty idea, unworthy of respect in the eyes of those who think beyond mere food and drink, those who know of nobler, fairer visions that humanity has conceived long before communism. But the existing social conditions endow communism with a false allure, a deceptive charm. And if we believe communism to be a doctrine of despotism and narrowness, steeped in suspicion of mankind and poisoned with envy, then we must also declare that the current order is criminal committing. Every day, the crime of making communism attractive to the deprived, of adorning it in their eyes, of driving them toward it in desperation, seeking escape from the tyranny of feudalism, the agony of deprivation, and the injustice of a world that defies the very nature of things. And finally, I accuse this social order of standing in absolute contradiction, both in its entirety and in its details, to the spirit of all religion to religion, as humanity has known it since its first divine revelations. And it stands in even greater contradiction to Islam in every interpretation of its essence. And all that the self-styled men of religion claim to justify this order is but a monstrous falsehood against the faith falsehoods that find no support in its truths or its principles. So woe unto those who write the book with their own hands and then say, "This is from God," that they may exchange it for a paltry price. Islam cries out against social injustice, against feudal enslavement, against inequity in reward and recompense. And it lends immeasurable strength to those who struggle against such conditions, empowering them in their striving and their struggle. No social order could be further removed from the spirit of Islam than the one we live in today. And no sin could be graver than the sin of those who claim allegiance to Islam while accepting such conditions or worse, justifying them in its name, when Islam is utterly innocent of them. These conditions cannot endure. They are in conflict with the very essence of human civilization, in every sense of the term. They stand opposed to the spirit of religion in every interpretation of its meaning. They defy the demands of the present age in every one of its imperatives. Thus, they contain within themselves no element of permanence, no seed of longevity, no force that might grant them an extension of life or a reprieve from their inevitable fate. At the crossroads, these prevailing social conditions are unsustainable not only in the eyes of those who oppose them, but even in the view of those who seek to uphold them. For surely they cannot be so blind as to believe that such a system can persist, whether for long or for short. And so they attempt to prop it up with artificial supports, hoping to prolong its existence for yet another season, be it brief or extended. From time to time they add new clauses to the penal code, expanding its reach to encompass what was previously beyond its grasp, or introducing harsher punishments not found in earlier statutes, hoping thereby to terrorize those who struggle for social justice by whatever means and under whatever banner. They allocate ever-increasing funds for propaganda in defense of this crumbling order. So pens are mobilized, newspapers are founded, and in the shadows conspiracies unfold against labor unions and against all institutions of resistance. Money fuels these schemes, as do threats and enticements, and in their hands lies the sword of the ruler and his gold, this for those who comply, that for those who resist. And from time to time they speak of social justice. Yes, by God, they speak of social justice, of the plight of the dispossessed, of the necessity of improving conditions. And today one hears many a pasha burning incense before the altar of social justice, for what better opiate for the toiling masses? It soothes their nerves, whets their appetites, and lulls them into hopeful dreams that they need not struggle alone for justice, for even the great pashas are striving for it alongside them. So why not rest, rejoice, and sleep in peace? But none of this shall avail them in the least, for nature, life, religion, civilization, economics, and reason itself are all arrayed against them. These are but empty pretexts, destined to be scattered like dust upon the wind. Today we stand at a crossroads. All of us have come to the realization that the current system cannot endure. All of us agree on this truth, even those who seek to uphold it. What remains in dispute is the nature of the system that must take its place. This question demands our utmost thought, for a new social order must inevitably arise to replace the old, an order whose coming is hastened each day by the very hands of those who cling desperately to the present one, driving yet another nail into its coffin. And the final nail is very near. Among us there are those who call for socialism. Among us there are those who dream of communism. Among us there are those who summon the world to Islam. And the existing order wages war against them all, for none of these alternatives would allow it to persist in peace. It wages war against communism first and foremost, openly, brazenly, without pretense or subterfuge. It wages war against Islam sometimes with evasions, sometimes with outright persecution, depending on the strength of the forces that support it, whether Islam presents a true and present danger. or whether it remains but sermons and homilies that can be silenced with words. As for socialism, it is tolerated so long as it poses no real threat. But the moment it gathers strength, it is fought with the same ferocity as communism and Islam alike. Thus, the parasitic social system shall yield to none of these three without a fight. A long and arduous struggle awaits one that must be waged with the pen, with inquiry, with organisation, with unity in pursuit of one of these visions, if only to rescue this nation from the precipice of ruin. This is our battle within. But beyond our borders there stand two mighty blocks, the communist bloc in the east and the capitalist bloc in the west. Each broadcasts its own cunning, calculated propaganda across the world, proclaiming that there exist but two paths, communism or capitalism, that the nations of the earth have no choice but to align themselves with one or the other. Communism speaks to the exploited peoples, to the downtrodden masses. It is in its interest to convince them that if they do not join the ranks of communism, they will inevitably fall under the yoke of capitalism. And given the suffering these masses have endured under capitalism, their choice in such a framing appears self-evident. Communism alone is the road to salvation. Capitalism, or rather democracy, addresses itself to the ruling elites, to the privileged classes. It is in its interest to persuade them that if they do not side with capitalism, they will be swallowed by communism. And for the ruling elites there is little doubt as to their choice, for they dread communism as a savage fears demons and ghouls. Now, both the Western and Eastern blocs are engaged in a relentless struggle for dominance. Their battle is not waged for the sake of humanity, nor for the liberation of peoples, but for their own imperial designs, with the nations of the world reduced to mere pawns in their grand chessboard. Their rhetoric, therefore, is entirely self-serving, and their logic consistent with their ambitions. But what of us? What is our place in this conflict? We have learned only too recently in Palestine that neither the Eastern nor the Western Bloc gives the slightest regard to the principles they so loudly proclaim. Neither do they give any regard to us, our rights, or our cause when the moment of truth arrives, and interests and ambitions lay bare their true face. We have no protector among them, neither here nor there. We are but strangers, powerless and unwanted, no matter which side we choose. We are but followers in the caravan, whether we tread this road or that. I can well understand that others might look down upon us, but that we should look down upon ourselves, this I cannot fathom. It is not merely an affront to the dignity of men of honour, it is an affront to the very nature of man himself. I know that among mankind there exist those who find a perverse pleasure in humiliation, who derive a strange delight from degradation, both physical and moral. Psychology recognizes such individuals as afflicted, listing them among the ranks of the mentally ill. But I do not know of any nation in its entirety that could suffer from such a disease. Nor can I conceive of an entire generation that would, by its very nature, relish disgrace and dishonour. Has our social order turned us into a nation of slaves, not merely to our masters, but to any power that looms upon the horizon, whether from the west or the east, across thousands of miles? I seek refuge in God from such a fate for the Muslim nation. For once there stood a man, a lone man, amid the halls of the American Congress, proclaiming to the Americans that it is sheer arrogance to assume that the world is divided into only two blocks, communism and democracy. There is, he declared, a third force in the world, the force of Islam. His voice rose in the very heart of America, issuing from the lips of the late Liaquat Ali Khan, Prime Minister of Pakistan, rising not merely from his mouth, but from his heart and his conscience, from his dignity and the dignity of his people, from the honour of the Muslim East, which refuses to debase itself before the world, which asserts its own existence, its own identity, and refuses to crawl at the tail end of history, a wretched and craven supplicant. And yet, lamentably, there are those among our own youth today who would lead us to that very fate without shame, without remorse. In this world, there exists a vast and contiguous expanse stretching from the shores of the Atlantic to the edges of the Pacific, encompassing more than 300 million souls who share a singular creed, a unified way of life, and traditions that are closely intertwined. Their language, if not yet one, is steadily on the path to becoming the common tongue of mutual understanding. And let us not forget the tens of millions scattered across Europe, Asia and Africa, those who hold fast to this same creed and adhere to the order it ordains. How then can any undertaking disregard this immense and interconnected entity? The Eastern and Western blocs, despite their cunning propaganda that might suggest otherwise, do not truly ignore this third force. Rather, they vie for its allegiance as one contends for possessions and spoils. Each of these two opposing camps has its justification, yet what excuse do we have for resigning ourselves to the status of mere objects, to be bartered and claimed at will? Our excuse lies in the social conditions that weigh upon us from within, depriving us of the leisure to reflect with clarity, the dignity to feel our worth, and the discernment to see beyond the veils of propaganda to the realities they conceal. This, indeed, may be a valid excuse for an individual, or even for a handful of individuals. But for a people, for a nation, no. A nation has no justification for allowing itself to be reduced to insignificance, to a trivial afterthought in the grand scheme of the world, especially when it holds within its grasp the means to preserve its dignity, restore its honour, and secure a place where its voice is heard and its counsel sought. And even if such a way did not already exist, the very essence of human dignity and the imperatives of national honour would demand that we seek one out, that we forge it with our own hands, that we bring it into being. But the truth is that this path does exist. It lies within our reach, within our present resources, not beyond our grasp, but ready to be seized. If we fail to see this, if we do not take hold of it, then it is not the bondage of slaves that shackles us, it is a most peculiar kind of blindness. And consider yet another matter. We have experimented until we have grown weary with those prefabricated moulds that we have begged for like mendicants here and there. We have tried them in every aspect of our intellectual, social and legislative life until we have fashioned from them a ridiculous carnival of appearances and affectations. Masks for thought, just as they are masks for the body. Let us take, for instance, the legal codes we first imported from France, and those we continue to import from every corner of the earth whenever we find ourselves in need of legislation. There exists at all times a profound discord between the spirit of this borrowed legislation and the spirit of the people upon whom it is imposed. The people, far from revering the law, glorify those who defy it, offering them encouragement, assistance and refuge, while withholding their trust from the authorities tasked with upholding it, refusing to aid them in gathering evidence, in presenting testimony, or in enforcing justice. Why? The answer commonly given is that the people are ignorant. But no, this is not the true reason. Even the educated among us do not respond to the call of the law. The real cause lies in the deep incompatibility between the spirit of the people and the alien spirit of the laws that govern them. These laws were not drawn from their social conditions, their historical experiences, their beliefs, their traditions, or their customs. They were drawn from a foreign milieu, a milieu with its own distinct history, its own distinct faith, and its own distinct needs and circumstances. And law, unless it springs forth as a natural response to the spirit and necessities of a people, will never be truly embraced. It will never command their loyalty or obedience. We do not call for an intellectual or social isolation from the advancing caravan of humanity. We are, after all, fellow travellers on this journey, partners in the edifice of human civilization. Indeed, we have in our time made immense contributions to this civilization, contributions so great that we fail to recognize them today, nor do we afford them the respect they deserve. But this blindness will persist only so long as our souls remain shackled by the mentality of servitude. What we lament is this perpetual mendicancy that has become our habit, this humiliating dependence upon others, this ceaseless borrowing without reciprocation, without offering anything in return. As long as we remain beggars, taking without giving, we shall have no place at the banquet of humanity but that of the supplicant and the outcast, not that of the generous and the noble. A pauper may beg, and the destitute may seek alms. But what shall we say of one who possesses a vast wealth, yet garbs himself in the rags of a beggar and stretches out his hand in supplication, calling it participation in civilization? Such participation is known only to mendicants. It is a mentality that only slaves would accept. There are, in truth, two meanings of civilization. The first is to have a distinct and eminent share in the construction of this great edifice, to contribute from the wellspring of one's own identity while benefiting from the accumulated wisdom of humanity. The second is to take blindly, to mimic thoughtlessly, to adopt without reflection or critique. The first meaning is understood by men, the second by apes, and my greatest fear is that we have come to understand only the latter. And now, what of the Western Bloc, the alliance of America, Britain and France? It enslaves us, it humiliates us, and it assigns us no place within its ranks except that of the servile and the submissive. Every notion of joining this camp arises from the shared interests of exploitative capitalism and the colonialism that safeguards it. Any other justification is but a deceptive shroud, meant to obscure the truth from the masses who fortunately have grown wise to such illusions. Twice we have offered our land, our skies, our sustenance, our livelihoods, and even our very lives to this alliance, twice within the span of a mere quarter-century. And twice we have received in return nothing but a slap in the face or a contemptuous kick at the journey's end. If we repeat this folly a third time, we shall not return merely with the same humiliation that might still be acceptable to those who have made peace with servitude. No, we shall return to utter devastation, to total and absolute ruin that will haunt our people for generations to come. Any form of mutual defence, in whatever guise it may be presented, or any alignment with a particular camp in this looming clash of titans, would mean exposing this defenceless nation to unmitigated destruction. This land so vulnerable, whose very survival depends on the Aswan Dam, could be obliterated with a single bomb. One blow to the dam would mean the annihilation of Egypt for generations. To tie ourselves to the chariot of any power in this impending confrontation is not merely a national crime, it is a crime against dignity, honour and conscience. Dignity, which the Western democracies have trampled upon twice before and still trample upon today, with an arrogance that disregards this nation, relying instead on its alliance with feudal lords and vested interests. This fragmented Arab world, still caught in the claws of Western imperialism, would be deserving of nothing but condemnation and scorn if it were to stretch forth its trembling hand once more to support the rapacious West in its hour of trial. For the East does not extend a hand, it offers its back, so that the West might place its feet upon it, cross the abyss, and then kick aside the broken beast that bore its weight. The capitalist and socialist West alike stand united in enmity against us, a single monolithic force, and in Palestine we see a stark witness to this enmity, openly displayed. At the same time, they subject us to humiliation and degradation with brazen arrogance. Only in the wake of defeat and collapse do they momentarily temper their insolent superiority. We have not yet forgotten how the Allied soldiers in the last war showed utter disregard for Egyptian lives, how their vehicles crushed our people under their wheels as one might trample upon stray dogs, how they trampled upon our dignity and honour as if we were mere chattel and slaves. These atrocities continue unabated in the vast expanse they occupy on the banks of the canal. We cannot forget the looks of disdain that gleamed in the eyes of the dregs of humanity, whom the Allies gathered from the ends of the earth and stationed in our land, how they cast those looks upon the crowds as they passed, how they turned those same contemptuous gazes even upon the officers and soldiers of our own police whenever they happened to witness one of the many incidents involving the Allied recruits. For what could our police do but stand by and watch as the Allies ran over Egyptians with their cars, kicked them with their boots, or extorted money from them in the streets? We have had our fill of the drunken revelry of their soldiers, the wanton debauchery of their female recruits, and the human refuse they brought with them or left behind for us to bear. Hundreds, thousands of defiled honours, squandered dignities, and a shame so loathsome that neither men nor women could endure it. We have suffered hunger so that these foreign vagabonds in Allied uniforms might be fed. We have endured nakedness so that our factories might labour to clothe them, in collusion with the capitalists and their agents, whether in the world of industry or in the seats of power. Never again shall we stand by while our daughters are snatched from the streets and homes, their chastity squandered in military camps and vehicles. Never again shall we allow our sustenance to be plundered from our fields and markets so that we suffer tuberculosis and starvation. Never again shall we allow our wealth and savings to be drained from our banks, leaving us to face crises and ruin. And then, after all this, for some arrogant colonialist like Mr. Churchill to stand before us, bestowing upon us the so-called grace of their protection, demanding not only that we forfeit our rightful dues from his country, but that we, in turn, compensate them for the sacrifices of their soldiers, their drunken, riotous, wanton soldiers. And as for France, her record in Tunisia, Algeria and Morocco, and even here in Egypt, is fouler than that of the British. France, the very nation that stood as an obstacle at the Montreux Conference against the abolition of foreign privileges, and had it not been for the British who, for their own selfish interests, sought to clip her wings in the Arab East, she would have remained our hindrance to this day. But her crimes in Tunisia, Algeria and Morocco remain the barbaric atrocities of medieval times, still unabated. France is a nation that has reached its end. She stands at the threshold of decay, despite all those who trumpet her cause in the Arab East. Yet she persists, with the brutality of the Mongols and the fanaticism of the Crusaders, killing, burning, torturing, mutilating, plundering, and robbing, committing in the Maghreb the very same atrocities that the Mongols and Crusaders once wrought upon the world. And yet, here in the East, France's lackeys have always sought to deceive us. Whenever we spoke of the crimes of their so-called tender mother, they would reply that one must not judge France by the actions of her politicians, for politics has neither conscience nor heart. But here now is their own esteemed journalist, Madame Tabouis, delivering a slap to the faces of these lackeys with her astonishing statements. During her recent visit to Egypt, she met with a representative of one of our newspapers in a fury, not for any reason other than that the Egyptian Prime Minister had responded to a letter from a leader of the Maghreb affirming his right to freedom. She even went so far as to say to the journalist, "I had prepared an article about your country, but now I shall not publish it. What have you gained from interfering in our affairs in North Africa?" And so the lackeys in Egypt swallowed this insult in silence, only to return once more to singing the praises of their beloved France, their tender mother. And what of America? Those who have never lived there may remember only her betrayal of our cause at the United Nations and in the war for Palestine. But those who have lived in America, who have seen how her press, her radio stations and her film industry have vilified our honour, smeared our reputation, how they have spread this hatred with deliberate malice and contempt, or those who have felt the seething hostility towards all that is Islamic and Eastern, or those who have witnessed firsthand how Americans regard people of colour and the depths of disdain they harbour toward them, these people know well what America truly is, and they know how we must repay her in kind for all that she has done. The Turkish battalion that went to Korea has already received its due reward at the hands of the Americans. It has learned its fate and the fate of any Eastern army that dares to fight alongside these arrogant oppressors. They left the Turks to defend the rear of their retreat, and when the Turks fulfilled their duty, the Americans abandoned them without air cover, without vehicles, without ammunition, without food. A small but telling example of what awaits the armies of the subjugated in any so-called Allied force. And the Turks, in the eyes of the Americans, are considered the most civilized of Easterners for one trivial reason. They are light-skinned. And yet even so, this was the treatment they received on the battlefield, the treatment of a master, faithless and cowardly, toward his slaves. Such is the story of the Western Bloc in its entirety, capitalist and socialist alike, arrayed against us. But what of the Eastern Front? Communism has laid bare the worth of its professed principles when it stood arming Israel, and yet Israel is the only state in the world built solely upon religion, and religion is the very foundation upon which communism refuses to recognize the legitimacy of nations. It is the last thing it would ever think to embrace or defend. But communism heeds no principle other than its own interests, trampling underfoot all the lofty ideals its propaganda proclaims. Communism may grant us bread. It may spare our souls from the bitter sight of obscene, ostentatious wealth that offends the innate sensibilities of man. But it grants us bread only to strip us of all that is sacred in life, not only our religious sanctities, but the very essence of our human dignity, imprisoning our souls within the narrow confines of mere sustenance and clothing. And it may seem that speaking of human sanctities in Egypt is a luxury, or that it is nothing more than a discourse on illusions and fantasies that have no real existence in the fabric of our social reality. And this is true, for such sanctities cannot thrive in a society shaped by the conditions we endure. The millions of human wrecks in Egypt, how can they concern themselves with such lofty ideals when they are consumed by the torment of hunger and deprivation? But what shall we say if there exists another system, one that grants us the bread that communism promises, that spares us the abhorrent spectacle of ostentatious wealth and class disparities, that fulfills for us the vision of a balanced society, where neither hardship nor oppression shall persist, and yet, at the same time, nourishes our souls, grants us freedom of thought, and elevates our human consciousness to its highest aspirations? What shall we say if there exists a system that does not relegate us to the tail end of the caravan, neither in the procession of communism nor in that of capitalism, but instead bestows upon us absolute social justice within and a cherished dignity among nations without? A system that restores our standing in the community of nations, that may even spare us the calamities of war, and with us spare humanity this affliction? What shall we say if there exists a system that resolves our internal struggles and at the same time does not leave us to stand at the table of humanity as humble beggars, but rather as contributors offering what we have, and it is not little? I wonder how a man can distance himself from the path of dignity only to choose the path of humiliation, how he can forsake the role of the giver to assume that of the supplicant, how he can abandon the seat of leadership to accept the station of servitude when he possesses the power to choose, if only he resists within himself the whisper of helplessness. We have much to offer, and we are not the destitute people many imagine us to be, nor as we have been portrayed by the Western and Eastern blocs alike. They have depicted us as such for a purpose known only to them, to replace our confidence with despair, our aspirations with surrender, so that we might fall as helpless prey into one snare or another. We have much to offer, yet we are in need of faith in ourselves, for in that faith lies life, and in that faith lies salvation. This was written in the first edition before the recent battles. As for today's events, they are laid bare before all, needing no further elaboration. In Islam, there is deliverance. If it becomes evident that Islam possesses the ability to resolve our fundamental problems, to grant us comprehensive social justice, to restore balance in governance, fairness in wealth, equality in opportunity, and justice in recompense, then without a doubt it shall prove more capable of shaping our society than any other doctrine we might seek to import, whether through blind imitation or through the servile act of begging to be included in the so-called human civilization. Indeed, if all this becomes clear, then Islam is certainly more suited to our reality than communism, beyond any question. Even if we were to assume that both systems are equal in their humanistic values and in their impact on social justice, Islam remains with us here, within our own lands. We need not summon it from foreign borders as we do with imported ideologies, those prefabricated moulds that arrive either too loose or too constricting, for they were not shaped by our hands, nor tailored to our measure, nor born from our pains and aspirations. Islam is a companion, a friend who has walked beside us for 1300 years, through prosperity and adversity, through bounty and hardship. A friend whom we have cherished and whom we have wronged, whom we have honoured and whom we have betrayed. And yet after all this he remains a friend, his presence stirs within our souls, his memory lingers in our hearts, his echoes resound in our conscience. He is no stranger to our spirit, to our customs, to our traditions, as communism is a foreigner whose aspects we admire and whose facets we reject, whose direction we sometimes follow and whose path we often question. Our sentiments toward it are divided, and such division does not guarantee the unity of our ranks in the pursuit of true social justice, as it would if we were to rally under the banner of Islam. Islam is a formidable argument against which exploitative capitalism has no defense as it does against communism. Those who are sincere in their call for social justice, those who seek justice for its own sake and who make it their true goal, rather than using it as a mere pretext to incite the masses toward the adoption of a particular ideology, one that is the primary objective. With justice as a mere tool, these individuals cannot afford to overlook the powerful weapon that is the Islamic faith. A weapon that is already in our hands, embedded in the very essence of our being, summoned by its name and answered, invoked in its cause and stirred into action. Those who wish to exclude Islam from the battle for social justice, choosing instead to fight under the banner of communism, are, if they are truly sincere in their call for justice, betraying themselves. Or they are betraying the cause of the people, out of ignorance of the immense power that Islam grants them. Or they harbour a dubious enmity toward this great force. Or they despise themselves and deny their own worth, content, like slaves, with the scraps from another's table and the humiliation of servitude. I fully understand why the exploiters and tyrants would conspire against Islam, seeking to remove it from this battle, either by manipulating professional clerics to issue deceitful rulings in its name, or by persecuting the true advocates of Islamic justice, accusing them of all manner of falsehoods to rid themselves of this sharp sword poised over the necks of oppression and exploitation. But for the very proponents of social justice to conspire against Islam, this I cannot understand. And behind such an act there must surely be a hidden motive, one which the innocent, those who seek justice for its own sake, must discern. They must recognize those who struggle for the people alone, those who dedicate themselves to this noble cause without deception or duplicity. But why should we rush to conclusions before we have presented our fundamental problems to Islam to see whether it holds solutions for them? What are the social ills that plague our current society and our present reality? They are 1. The unjust distribution of land and wealth, 2. The issue of labour and wages, 3. The lack of equal opportunities, 4. The corruption of the workforce and the weakness of production. And there are other secondary problems, which are but the fruits and consequences of these primary afflictions, symptoms of the same disease. Let us take each of these issues one by one and present them to Islam to see how it addresses them with wisdom, confidence and peace. The unjust distribution of land and wealth. No one disputes any longer that the distribution of agricultural land in Egypt is gravely unjust and imbalanced, and that it must be rectified without delay. The debate today is not over the truth of this reality, but over the means by which it should be remedied. When we reach the point where 1,294 individuals own 2 million fedans of cultivable land in a country with a population of 20 million, where the total cultivated land does not exceed 6 million fedans, then there can be no argument about the injustice and corruption of this distribution, and the disparity in wealth beyond land ownership is even worse. Fewer than 2,000 individuals control more than a third of the financial assets represented in banks and corporations. Thus, opinions may differ regarding the method of treatment, but not regarding the existence of the ailment itself. Even a man like Muhammad Qutb, who thinks with awareness from a capitalist perspective and recognizes that the current state of land ownership must change to avert the storms looming on the horizon, proposes a scheme to limit land ownership to a fixed maximum, with the state purchasing the surplus to establish small farms. It is a purely capitalist mode of thinking, for it does nothing more than transform the swollen wealth of landed estates into an equally swollen wealth of liquid assets, all the while taking care to avoid the ostentatious and glaring display of feudalism. But Western-style capitalism in Egypt fails to perceive this intent, and so it revolts against it, accuses it of communism, and pursues it relentlessly in Parliament. Or perhaps it is we who are the fools, while capitalism is the shrewd and conscious force. Indeed, For the feudal lords know well that the peasants tied to the land are nothing more than human wreckage, frail, broken beings worn down by hunger and disease, incapable of perceiving their own existence or dignity, unable to think of justice or equity. It is thus preferable for their wealth to remain invested in the land alongside this harmless wreckage, rather than be compelled to direct it toward industry, where workers would unite, grow in awareness, and one day demand their human rights. As for the state, it has in recent years attempted to take certain measures, though, of course, within the confines of a capitalist mentality and in accordance with the interests of the landowners and capitalists whom it represents. It has enacted inheritance taxes, general income taxes, and introduced the principle of progressive taxation while exempting small landowners from these burdens. Yet these are feeble steps, whose effects are scarcely visible, for the prevailing conditions have reached such a degree of excess and corruption that they cannot be remedied by these gentle touches, administered with delicate silken gloves. Thus the call of communism resounds: there is no cure, no salvation, except through the prescribed path. But what then is Islam's perspective on these matters? What is its plan and its way? Islam affirms the principle of private ownership of this. There is no doubt thereby diverging from the fundamental premise of communism in this regard. Yet what kind of private ownership is it that Islam endorses and guarantees? It is ownership that arises from a legitimate foundation through means recognized as lawful by Islam. In Islam, labor is regarded as the sole valid basis for ownership and earning labor in all its forms, whether physical or intellectual. On this foundation, usury is prohibited, for the surplus gained from a loan does not result from labor, but from capital itself. And capital, in and of itself, is not considered a legitimate source of profit, nor does it merit reward, for reward is due only to human effort. There is no dispute that this is the fundamental principle of ownership and earning in Islam. Furthermore, Islam establishes specific means for the growth of wealth and does not sanction any increase that falls outside the bounds of its lawful methods. These methods exclude usury, as has been mentioned, as well as gambling, deceit, monopolization, excessive and exploitative profit that contradicts the spirit of fairness, and the unjust deductions from workers' wages deductions that, according to some Islamic jurists, may amount to half of the profits. Naturally, Islam does not recognize theft, plunder, extortion, or coercion as legitimate means of acquiring or increasing wealth. Any ownership that does not arise from the legitimate foundations recognized by Islam, or that, though initially lawful, grows through means Islam does not sanction, is a false form of ownership, unrecognized by Islam, unprotected by its guarantees. This is the first principle regarding ownership in Islam. By its very nature, it prevents the excessive accumulation of wealth from the outset. For wealth that is acquired through personal effort, that does not yield exorbitant profits, that ensures workers receive half of its returns, that does not multiply through usury or deceit, and that is not built upon monopolization or exploitation, such wealth, by its very nature, will never reach the degree of inflation that harms society and creates vast class disparities. To these natural restraints must be added a permanent fiscal obligation. The tax of zakat, that sacred duty, which through a fixed system levies between 2.5% and 5% of an individual's wealth every year. Here a word must be said regarding this obligation, for it is often distorted by those who seek to misrepresent it. They paint it as an act of humiliating charity, one that degrades human dignity. Yet in reality it is the state that collects this tax, just as it collects any other tax, and it is the state that distributes it according to a well-organized system adaptable to the evolving needs of society. Where, then, is the humiliation in such a system? The detractors and manipulators persist in depicting zakat as no more than a scene of benevolence, a wealthy man who donates, and a poor man who receives in gratitude. A superior hand giving and an inferior hand taking directly, face to face, from one individual to another. Whence did they derive this distorted, fabricated image? I do not know. If the state today were to impose a tax for education, allocating its revenues solely for educational purposes, constructing schools, paying teachers' salaries, providing books, tools, and even meals for students, would anyone claim this to be a system of begging and charity that insults the dignity of teachers and students merely because the funds come from the wealth of the affluent and are spent on the needs of the less fortunate? If the state were to legislate a law that levies 2.5% from every fortune, great or small, to build and equip an army, and if it were to allocate this tax exclusively for military expenditures, would anyone declare that the army is begging, that its dignity is being debased, simply because the state collects its funding from the wealth of the rich and distributes it equally between the rich and the poor in its service? Zakat is a tax like these other taxes. The state collects it, then distributes it in designated channels, not as a mere act of individual charity that moves directly from one hand to another. If some individuals today choose to distribute their zakat personally, it is only because the state does not officially collect this tax and allocate it according to its discretion in response to changing societal needs. Yet such is the blindness or the deliberate deception that prevails in Egypt, that people continue to speak of zakat as if it were a form of personal charity that degrades the soul and encourages dependency. And such is the audacity of those who distort the plainest of truths, an audacity that can only arise in an environment where listeners and readers are so naive as to be utterly deceived. And such an environment is indeed abundant in Egypt, praise be to God. Nay, it is even abundant among those who call themselves intellectuals, those who welcome every attack against the systems of Islam with warmth and enthusiasm, eager to prove that they are truly enlightened. Are we not living in an age of dwarfs, a generation of dwarfs? In any case, let us proceed on our path to elucidate the fundamental principles of Islam regarding the issue of the unequal distribution of wealth and property. We have seen that Islam does not recognize ownership that is not founded upon a legitimate basis of acquisition, nor does it acknowledge wealth that has not grown through means deemed lawful. Furthermore, we have observed that Islam prescribes a fixed system whereby 2.5% of capital is allocated to specific social guarantees for certain groups in need, whether as a lump sum to be used as capital for enterprise, or as periodic stipends for those unable to work, or in any other form necessitated by the public good. Yet this is not the entirety of Islam's perspective on financial rights. Such measures are applicable only when society is in a state of equilibrium, free from turmoil and imbalance, and when there are no exceptional exigencies, whether internal or external, demanding urgent intervention. However, in times of crisis, when extraordinary needs arise, the right of the community over wealth becomes absolute, and individual ownership cannot stand in opposition to this collective right. Islam entrusts the state, acting as the representative of society, with this authority, not only to address immediate necessities, but also to prevent foreseeable harm. The protection of society from external aggression is as paramount as safeguarding it from internal disarray. In granting the state this power, Islam does not impose arbitrary restrictions, save for the overarching imperative of social welfare and public interest. Thus, the state possesses the authority to impose special taxes beyond general taxation as it deems fit, a levy for the military, another for education, yet another for hospitals, and one for social security, as well as any other tax necessitated by unexpected expenses that were not accounted for in the general budget, or that exceed ordinary financial capacity in times of need. Moreover, the state has the right to expropriate property and wealth within defined limits whenever it deems such measures necessary to rectify social imbalances or to meet essential expenditures required to shield society from afflictions. The afflictions of ignorance, disease, deprivation, extravagance, and the festering of resentment between individuals and groups indeed, from all calamities that may befall a community. In fact, Islam grants the state the authority to redistribute wealth entirely, even if it had been acquired through legitimate means and had grown through lawful channels, should the protection of society as a whole necessitate such action. For in Islam's vision of social solidarity, There exists no fundamental conflict between individual rights and the rights of the community. Any harm that befalls society is regarded as harm inflicted upon all its members, compelling the state to protect individuals even from their own inclinations should the need arise. From what has been said, it becomes evident that lesser interventions are naturally within the realm of possibility. The state may allow landowners to retain possession of their lands, while granting them only as much as they can personally cultivate, and conferring usufructuary rights over the remainder to those in need, enabling them to work the land for their own benefit, free of charge. Alternatively, the state may regulate land rents, setting a fixed price that cannot be exceeded, or determining a fair share of the produce that does not oppress the tenant. It may intervene in these matters as the circumstances require, bound only by the imperative of justice and the avoidance of oppression. A judicial body, such as a state council, could be entrusted with ensuring this fairness. Thus, the issue of private ownership exists only in the minds of those who do not truly comprehend Islam, or those who, despite knowing its precepts, conceal the truth revealed by God, while clamouring for an absolute guarantee of private property, much like those who selectively quote and do not approach prayer and without completing the verse. Private ownership is indeed respected in Islam, yet it remains subject to the conditions and possibilities outlined above. This system neither stifles the natural human inclination to acquire property, nor discourages individuals from exerting their utmost effort in production. At the same time, it ensures that the fruits of such endeavours ultimately serve the collective welfare, to be placed at the disposal of society whenever the need arises. It is a system more just than communism, more skillful and more comprehensive. More just because it does not infringe upon private ownership except when necessity dictates. More skillful because it guarantees the highest possible level of individual effort in production. More comprehensive because it prepares the individual for society and society for the individual. The issue of labour and wages. Since Islam regards labour as both the means of acquiring property and the method by which wealth is increased, it follows that work is a fundamental pillar of both social and economic life. Indeed, Islam surrounds labour with a halo of sanctity and accords dignity to the working hand, so much so that the noble prophet of Islam once said of a hand calloused by toil, "This is a hand beloved by God and his messenger." His sayings abound with references to the sacred nature of labour. Whoever toils with his hands until evening, his sins shall be forgiven. God loves the skilled worker. No one has ever eaten food better than that which he has earned with his own hands. As we have previously mentioned, some Islamic jurists have upheld the right of workers to claim half the profits of an enterprise. Furthermore, the general Islamic principle that grants the ruler the authority to enact new regulations in response to emerging needs allows the state the freedom to legislate on labour rights in accordance with the evolving demands of society. The doctrine of masali mursala, public interests not explicitly addressed in scriptural texts, and the principle of sad al-darai, blocking the means to anticipated harm, ensure that the state possesses ample latitude to promulgate labour laws as circumstances require, always within the bounds of justice, ensuring the worker's dignity and consent. Within this vast and flexible framework, there is ample scope to address unforeseen contingencies and exceptional challenges, guided by the overarching principle of social welfare and the fundamental Islamic injunctions against exploitation. Islam prohibits all measures that lead to excess on one side and deprivation on the other, or that concentrate wealth within a narrow elite while depriving the broader community of its fair share. The Quranic injunction is unequivocal, so that wealth does not merely circulate among the rich among you. Any wage system that results in such an imbalance is forbidden in Islam. Within this framework, and in light of the principles outlined above, wage regulations can be formulated with confidence and clarity. As for working hours, they are governed by the general Islamic principle that prohibits harm. There shall be no harm and no reciprocation of harm. Any arrangement that unduly exhausts the worker, deprives him of necessary rest, or denies him psychological security regarding his present and future is unlawful in Islam. and must not be sanctioned. It is the duty of the state to legislate within these limits, ensuring fairness based on prevailing conditions. Labour systems evolve perpetually and their circumstances are in constant flux. For this reason, Islam has laid down broad legislative principles while refraining from imposing rigid, immutable laws. This approach enables the Islamic framework to accommodate the ever-changing needs of life, to benefit from the accumulated experiences of human civilization, and to serve as a vigilant guardian over the general direction of social development, ensuring that it does not deviate from its ethical foundations or betray its spirit and ideals. There remains one final aspect of private ownership that I have chosen to address here, as it pertains to monopoly, a concept intrinsically linked to both public wealth and labour rights. For monopolization often results in the employer exercising dominion over workers just as he dominates the market and consumers. Those employed in an industry monopolized by an individual or a corporation find themselves in a system akin to feudalism. The only difference is that feudalism monopolizes land, whereas monopoly dominates entire sectors of production. Islam prohibits monopolistic practices just as it forbids what is today termed exclusive privileges concerning public resources and public services. What is now called the nationalization of public utilities is, in essence, a fundamental principle of Islam. All these existing monopolies, such as the monopoly over sugar production, the monopoly over alcohol production, and the monopoly over cement production, along with all known exclusive privileges, such as the canal company concession, the tram company concession, and the concessions granted to the companies controlling electricity and water supplies, Islam does not approve of any of these systems. First, because they serve as instruments of price manipulation and labour exploitation. Second, because they become means of unjust wealth accumulation that do not ensure equal opportunities for all. Third, because they often lead to stagnation in production and a refusal to implement necessary improvements. The corruption of work and the weakness of production. I must draw urgent attention to a grave danger looming over us, one that threatens our very existence as a nation, the danger of widespread corruption pervading every institution of labour within the state and society. A corruption that results in a general decline in productivity, at times reaching the point of complete paralysis. I have spoken of this paralysis in the preface of this book, yet I do not wish to limit myself to what I have already stated. We stand today on the very edge of an abyss, on the brink of ruin, due to diminishing yields and declining production. Poverty, misery, and humiliation afflict us not merely because of the misdistribution of resources, but because the total wealth of the nation itself is meagre, and because general productivity falls far below what it ought to be. This paralysis and this corruption are both the offspring of various social maladies. The unjust distribution of wealth and property, a corrupt system of labour and wages where effort and reward are not fairly aligned. The absence of equal opportunities, which crushes the potential of those who were not fortunate enough to be born into prominent households or who lack the protection of wealth and influence. And beyond all this, the moral decay that arises from these very factors, a decay born of an emptiness in the conscience, a void unfilled by a compelling creed that awakens in the individual a sense of duty and propels the entire society toward creativity, advancement, and excellence. We have previously expounded Islam's stance on the three great dilemmas that individually or collectively give rise to this monumental fourth crisis. Now we turn to see how Islam addresses this issue as well. Islam confronts the problem by first eliminating its material causes, and then by filling the soul with a driving faith, a faith that occupies the void within, elevates it toward God, and bestows upon the individual a purpose greater than himself, the society in which he lives and the humanity of which he is a part. Those afflicted with spiritual shallowness, dwarfish selfhood, and an absence of conscience may imagine that what we say here is mere sermonizing, devoid of any real significance in practical life. But we do not write for such people, for they are a lost cause in every age. The conscience of humanity has never been extinguished, despite their ceaseless attempts to stifle it in every land. A man without a comprehensive creed that binds him to both earth and heaven is but a lost and insignificant being, discarded and forgotten. Even in the world of communism, which scoffs at spiritual forces in life, faith remains indispensable. Without the fire of conviction, how else did thousands march willingly to their deaths in Siberia and the prisons of the Tsars, driven by the fervour that ultimately secured the triumph of the communist regime? Sick social conditions have led us to corruption in integrity and conscience, to a reckless disregard for work and duty, an affliction that is not confined to any single sphere. The crime of favouritism in government offices has left both the privileged and the forgotten alike indifferent to their work. For effort does not yield results, nor does it bring reward or punishment. The crime of depriving workers of just wages and social security has led them to neglect their duties, for in a world without justice, disorder is easier than discipline. The crime of denying equal opportunities has squandered and shattered immense human potential, reducing it to mere fragments and wreckage. The crime of concentrating all wealth in the hands of a few and hoarding it within a narrow circle has left millions unemployed, idling away their time in the cafes of the cities or loitering by the granaries in the villages. These millions, who should be part of the nation's productive force, have been turned into mere consumers, for they find no work to do. Meanwhile, the state, unable to finance developmental projects, subsists on a feeble budget drawn from meagre taxation out of fear of harming the wealth of the elite. And to all this disaster we must add the spiritual emptiness that has drained the people of the faith that drives them to labour, and the moral sensitivity that only a deep creed can instill. Thus, the vicious cycle is complete, a cycle that only Islam can break. Islam and the battle against unemployment. Islam wages war against the spirit of idleness with all its might, combating its causes through the very means we have outlined. It addresses the problem within the realm of conscience and sentiment, as well as in the world of work and reality. Unemployment is Islam's sworn enemy, in every guise, every context, and every form. Islam is the adversary of idleness born of excessive wealth. There is no reward except for effort, and no earnings except through labour. As for those who sit idle and do nothing, their wealth is illegitimate, their riches unlawful. The state has the right to utilize such wealth for the benefit of society, rather than leaving it in the hands of a lazy, unproductive idler. Islam is the enemy of idleness born of laziness, of love for ease and comfort, of seeking livelihood through the easiest means, such as begging. It warns those who beg while capable of work that they shall come on the day of judgment with no flesh left upon their faces. Islam is the enemy of idleness in the guise of piety and devotion. Worship is not a full-time occupation, nor is it meant to consume all of life's hours, and when the prayer is concluded, disperse through the land and seek of God's bounty. To spend one's days in endless chants and prayers without engaging in productive work is foreign to Islam. Islam does not condone the existence of thousands in Egypt who have no occupation other than frequenting mosques to perform prayers or reciting supplications at festivals. Were the matter left to Islam, all would be enlisted into productive work. If none was available, the state would take responsibility, for the right to work is as fundamental as the right to food. Labour is a form of purification for the soul and body, an act of devotion in Islam, one that the state must facilitate and provide. Unemployment is a corrupting force, and the state must shield society from its consequences, cutting off its roots. And if, after all this, one still chooses idleness, then the state must intervene, must compel him to work to the best of his ability. Other problems solved by Islam. And now, Islam does not merely solve our social problems, nor does it confine us within our own internal borders in isolation and withdrawal. Rather, it grants us a distinct personality that enables us to stand out among the nations of the world. For Islam is a creed of pride and dignity. It refuses to let us become mere appendages or blind followers, nor does it permit us to hand over our destiny to either the Eastern or the Western bloc, or to stand under any banner other than that of Islam, the banner under which a vast community of more than 300 million people could unite. A community that, with its strategic centers and abundant natural resources, holds sway over both East and West alike. If only it had one flag under which to assemble, standing tall in the pride of Islam and the honor of Islam. It is not necessary at this moment for there to be a single government over this vast expanse of land. What is essential is that it unites under one banner. For Islam is Islam, its laws are its laws, and its identity is so strong and distinct that it cannot be diluted or obscured within any other system. Its spirit is so powerful that it cannot be dissolved or annihilated. We have become mere colonies and spheres of influence only because we have abandoned this spirit, so it has abandoned us. We have been ashamed to stand under its banner, so it has disowned us. We have lost ourselves in the tides of others, so we have lost the mark of dignity, pride and respect. Let us resolve to take the only path that can restore our standing between the Eastern and Western blocks, the path that grants us the respect of all nations. Perhaps even it may restore to the world its peace and security when the Muslim bloc rises once more, taking into its hands the balance of justice and stability, and putting an end to the madness that now grips both blocs as they push the world toward a third great war, warring and contending over us as though we were mere possessions, colonies and objects. Then no longer shall the voices of those who cry out in the lands of Islam from here and there be heard, join this camp or that, as if there were no path for us except one of subjugation, as if we were forever condemned to remain at the tail end of the procession, never to have an independent existence, never to command respect, as if we were incapable of emerging as a third force, a force that holds the balance of power in its hands, representing a unique social philosophy, an Islamic vision that encompasses all the virtues of socialism and communism while remaining free from all their flaws. A vision that offers something greater than both higher horizons, a more encompassing justice, and a noble ideal for life that the world has never known before. We possess the power to offer humanity this idea, an idea that aims for complete human cooperation, for a true and just social solidarity, for elevating the worth of life to a level befitting a world that originates from God. Our place, then, is not at the tail end of the procession, but at the helm holding the reins. Islam must govern. If Islam is to function, then Islam must govern. For this religion was not sent to be confined within cloisters and temples, nor to remain hidden in hearts and consciences. It was sent to govern life, to shape its course, and to mould society according to its comprehensive vision of existence, not merely through preaching and exhortation, but also through legislation and organization. It came to translate its principles and doctrines into a living system, into a vibrant reality, transforming its commands and prohibitions into a society of flesh and blood, a people who walk upon this earth, embodying in their conduct, their social relations, and the structure of their governance, the principles of this faith, its ideals, its laws, and its regulations. From what we have already discussed regarding social and national problems, and the way Islam addresses them, it becomes indisputably clear that Islam must govern. Otherwise, how could it confront these issues and others like them? How could it resolve them and provide effective solutions? It cannot redistribute wealth according to the needs of society, or establish justice between effort and reward, or grant all people equal opportunities in life, or mobilize idle forces for labor and production, or direct the state toward a specific position in international affairs, or organize armies and prepare for defense, or any of the other fundamental principles upon which its very existence is based, principles that form its comprehensive vision for shaping life. Islam cannot do any of this if it remains merely a lingering belief in the heart, a humble prayer in the mosque, or a silent communion between the servant and his sustainer. Those who speak of Islam and claim that it does not need to govern, or that it can be realized in life without ruling over life, are uttering words of such triviality and pettiness that they do not even merit serious discussion or intellectual debate. Such people do not merely reveal their ignorance of the true nature of this religion, fundamental as it is. They do not merely expose their lack of understanding of its most basic truths, truths that even beginners would be ashamed not to know. Rather, they demonstrate an ignorance of all the essential elements that shape human nature, of all the forces that influence the formation of societies, of all the necessary intellectual foundations required to comprehend life, let alone to pass judgment upon it. Yet in this generation, where pettiness and shallowness abound, where superficial thinking and cultural shallowness prevail, such talk is sometimes accepted even to the point where ministers in positions of power repeat it without shame, allowing the people of Egypt and beyond to witness the extent of their naivete, their ignorance, and their detachment from real culture and deep thought. These very men who call themselves, or are called by others, intellectuals. The Western Christian world and secular rule. In the Christian West, an individual enters a church to listen to sermons and hymns. His heart may be moved as he listens to the preacher's emotional words, to the choir's melodies, to the solemn chants, and to the fragrant incense wafting through the air. But when he leaves the church, he finds another law governing real life, one that has no connection to the spirit of Christianity. He finds a society built upon this law, a law that has no relation whatsoever to the spiritual essence of Christianity. Many times I've entered these churches, listened to the preacher's sermons, to the music, hymns and prayers. Many times I've tuned in to the broadcasts of Christian clergy on radio stations during their religious holidays. Always they strive to forge a connection between the individual's heart and God. But not once have I heard one of them say, "How can you be a Christian in your daily life?" For Christianity is nothing more than a call to spiritual purification. It did not include within it a system for governing worldly affairs, but instead left that to Caesar. The result of this in the Christian world has been that Christianity exists in one realm, while real life exists in another. Over time, Christianity became confined within the church, while life outside moved further and further away from its purified spirit. When, in recent years, the church sought to reconnect with the masses, it did not lift them up to its ideals, rather it lowered itself to them. And when I say lowered, I do not mean that it sought to simplify or practically address life's challenges. I mean that it began to flatter base desires and indulgences, to overlook vulgar pleasures and unchecked whims, merely to ensure that society would not reject it again, as it had during the era of the Renaissance and Enlightenment. The tragic mimicry of the West, with a foolish naivete and a shallow superficiality, we have attempted to do the same with Islam, not because Islam lacks laws governing worldly life, but because, with the servile mentality of slaves and the imitative nature of apes, we wish to make Egypt a mere replica of Europe. And since Europe is governed by secular laws rather than religious ones, we followed suit without realizing that Europe had no alternative, for Christianity did not provide it with a system for life. It offered only spiritual belief and prayer. Islam realized that faith alone cannot manifest itself in the reality of life unless it is embodied in a specific social order, translated into laws that govern life and shape its ever-renewing relationships. Yet in our blind folly, we have failed to perceive what Islam so clearly understood, and upon which it built itself a faith that takes form in a law, and a law that is but the interpretation and realization of that faith. A unity of sentiment and legislation, from which emerges a living reality, encompassing both creed and conduct, worship and transactions, inward intentions and outward deeds, individuals and communities alike. We have heard the Europeans declare that religion is merely a private matter between the individual and his sustainer, with no place in civil affairs. And like empty-headed parrots, we have repeated what we have heard. Yes, religion is indeed a private affair between man and his creator in Christianity. And Europe has its excuse in this, for its religion never provided it with guidance on how to structure civil life. When the Church Fathers did intervene in worldly matters, they did so in pursuit of their own interests, inspired not by the Christian faith, which contained nothing regarding civil governance, but by personal ambition. When the tyranny of the Church and its clergy grew oppressive, masquerading as divine authority to further worldly greed, the people cast off this yoke and confined the Church to the boundaries set for it by its own doctrine at the very threshold of the sanctuary. But Islam established a society governed by its own laws that provides a reference point to curb any tyranny that might arise from those who would call themselves men of religion, should they seek to emulate the clergy of the Church and usurp a spiritual authority that Islam does not recognize. Yet, despite the clarity and simplicity of these truths, we find in this era of dwarfs in which we live those who strive to appear as highly cultured intellectuals croaking like ravens about the necessity of separating religion from the state, as if religion should concern itself only with the affairs of the soul, leaving the governance of life to earthly laws. In times of decline, even nations of great heritage witness an astonishing diminishment, a strange smallness of spirit. And so the frailest of birds fluffs its feathers and struts about. But the reign of dwarfs in Egypt is short-lived and fast approaching its end. I am utterly convinced that this nation has no salvation, no life, unless it returns to a mighty creed, one that shakes off the pettiness and triviality of this generation and fills its existence with movement, vitality, and bold endeavour. And today, for Egypt, there is no creed mightier than Islam. Nationalism alone is no longer sufficient. The proof is that it has failed to stand against the tide of communism in many lands. The idea of social justice among individuals within society has asserted itself so powerfully that it has overshadowed mere patriotic fervour in nations where people are divided into masters and slaves. Islam alone possesses the capacity to realize both ideals without contradiction, without conflict, without excess. The ideal of national solidarity within the greater Islamic homeland, wherever Islam has spread its shade, and the ideal of complete social justice within this vast domain. And Islam does not secure this complete social justice for Muslims alone, but extends it to all inhabitants of this land, regardless of their religion, race, language or colour. This is its supreme human distinction, one that no other creed has ever achieved. Yet we must constantly remind ourselves that none of this will be realized merely by people attending mosques, celebrating the Prophet's birthday, delivering sermons in praise of the Master of Messengers. Nor will it be achieved by filling the land with mystics and dervishes, chanting supplications, performing invocations, carrying prayer beads, murmuring or raising their voices in ecstatic cries. Nor will it be accomplished by having a council of senior scholars issuing decrees of excommunication, only to later grant absolution when circumstances and conditions change, nor by issuing verdicts condemning Abu Dhar al-Ghifari because he called for social justice for the poor, nor by drafting ornamental petitions filled with pious admonitions and lamentations over the moral decay of our times. None of this will avail us in the least. What alone will serve is that Islam governs life and directs its course, that the state be ruled by Islam, that the laws regulating relations between the people and their government, and between the government and its people, be derived from Islamic law, not merely family law, but also criminal law, civil law, commercial law, and every legislation that moulds the structure of society and grants it its unique form and system. The current constitution declares that the official religion of the state is Islam. This can mean nothing other than that all laws must be drawn from the Islamic Sharia, and Islamic Sharia is fully capable of responding to the demands of modern life, its growth and its renewal, while benefiting from our own experiences and from the experiences of humanity at large, in ways that align with Islam's overarching vision and supreme principles concerning life. I do not claim that contemporary Islamic jurisprudence is presently capable of encompassing all the intricate demands of modern life, for its development was arrested for a long period. But the foundational principles of Islamic law, with their inherent flexibility and comprehensiveness, are fully capable of addressing life's needs, as I have demonstrated in our major challenges, while the formulation of specific legal provisions, drawn from these general principles, remains a task that must continuously adapt to ever-evolving circumstances. Some may ask, why all this effort? Why not simply abandon this Sharia altogether and adopt the ready-made laws that humanity has now perfected? Such a question can only come from one who has grown so accustomed to borrowing that he has lost all sense of his own identity, his own nationhood, his own living history that pulses within him. It is the question of a shallow mind that fails to grasp how individuals and environments interact. And ultimately, it is the question of one who does not understand from where nations derive their strength and resilience in the struggle for existence. The path we call for is the only path that ensures the soul of this nation will rise and aspire to a noble and dignified life. It is the only path that will enable the Islamic bloc to emerge and distinguish itself amid the Eastern and Western powers, a distinct society with its own clear characteristics, its own independent personality. For one who possesses an authentic heritage only adds to it and enriches it with new gains. But as for the bankrupt beggar, he will never possess true wealth, no matter how long he spends his life seeking alms and handouts. Islam must govern in order to realize its existence and to establish that complete and just society whose features we have outlined. None of this can be achieved while Islam remains absent from the governance of life. Islam must govern in order to present to humanity a society of an entirely different kind, one that may fulfill the dream that communism aspires to, yet fails by confining itself to mere material needs, one that socialism seeks yet deprives of spirit and freedom due to its materialistic nature, one that Christianity once envisioned yet never provided with laws or regulations. Islam must govern because it is the only constructive and dynamic creed that merges the aspirations of Christianity and communism into a perfect synthesis, one that embraces their goals yet surpasses them with balance, harmony and moderation. The world cannot dispense with a positive creed. Christianity has played its role and is no longer an active force in shaping human destiny. Today, it is the masses that lead the Church, and the Church follows them, without pause, without hesitation, without even defending its own most sacred principles or highest spiritual aims. Finally, Islam must govern. For Islam was fully aware of its own nature and of the nature of life when it proclaimed, "There is no Islam without governance and no Muslims without Islam, and those who do not judge by what God has revealed it is they who are the disbelievers. Truly has God spoken." Doubts concerning the rule of Islam. Dark clouds of doubt shroud Islam and its governance in the minds of this generation. Some of these doubts arise from sheer ignorance, an ignorance so blatant that its bearers refuse to acknowledge it as a deficiency in their knowledge. At the very least, as individuals living in a state whose official religion is Islam, and where the majority of the population adheres to this faith, they ought to recognize that Islam is an essential component of any study of their society, as well as any intellectual or artistic endeavor within its milieu. Yet, instead of admitting this flaw in their intellectual formation, they turn it into a virtue, or worse, they parade it as evidence of their enlightenment. Other doubts stem from a fundamental misunderstanding of the very nature of religion itself, a misunderstanding conflating Islam with those who in this age are called men of religion. This confusion distorts the image of Islam in the minds of people, for these so-called men of religion are, in reality, among the furthest from embodying its essence, whether in knowledge, conduct, or even in their outward appearance. However, the ignorance of Islam's true nature, an ignorance cultivated by an educational system inherited from the colonial era and still overseen by those moulded by that colonial presence, leaves the masses with no conception of Islam except through these figures, whom they recognize as religious men. And alas, this is the worst possible representation of Islam, or indeed of any faith. Further doubts arise from the confusion between Islam's vision of governance and the nature of certain governments that claim for themselves the title of Islamic states. Yet just as those men of religion fail to represent Islam's ideals, so too do these governments fail to embody Islam's system of rule. Both are false and distorted representations indeed. They are the very antithesis of what they claim to be. But the profound ignorance of Islam's concept of governance, even among the so-called educated, leaves no alternative image in the public mind except this grotesque and fraudulent caricature. Another source of doubt is the conflation of the Islamic ruler with certain historical figures who falsely claim to rule in Islam's name while being utterly devoid of its spirit and principles. The colonial education that has shaped generations through the schools, the press, and society at large has allowed such misconceptions to take root, clouding minds and emotions, and turning people away from a system of governance they perceive as oppressive and abhorrent. And yet, all these doubts could have been dispelled with nothing more than a proper understanding of Islam's historical and social realities. In other words, had this generation received a genuine and fitting education? Yes, fitting. For it is unbefitting of an educated person to remain utterly ignorant of such a fundamental force shaping their society, the intellect of their people, their art, literature, and their very perception of the universe and life. Nor is this knowledge as daunting as many imagine, conjuring up in their minds visions of ancient tomes filled with obscure scholastic riddles and the enigmatic teachings of traditional seminaries. No, this is not the Islamic education that the present generation requires. For Islam is ease, not hardship. It is a creed of clarity, devoid of complexity and ambiguity. It is a social system marked by balance and harmony, neither feudalism nor indulgence, neither deprivation nor excess. It is a system of governance in which there are no divine rights of kings, no blue blood, no tyranny, and no despotism. Although the ignorance of this generation, particularly among its intellectuals, is inexcusable, we nevertheless choose here to discuss the doubts that cloud their understanding of Islam's governance. We address those whose intentions are pure, whose hearts are free from malice, and whose misconceptions stem solely from ignorance rather than from ulterior motives or hostility. As for those who deliberately distort the truth, our discussion with them belongs to another chapter, one in which we shall confront outright enmity towards the rule of Islam. The allegation of primitiveness in Islamic governance. Many people conflate the historical emergence of Islam with its abstract universal principles capable of expansion, adaptation, and application across all dimensions of life. When such individuals hear the term Islamic governance, their imagination is immediately seized by images of rudimentary tents in the desert, of Bedouins astride their camels, or of Arabs dwelling in humble huts. In their naivete, they assume that an Islamic system of rule necessitates a return to that primitive existence, stripped of all the achievements of human civilization attained over the past 14 centuries. To them, Islamic governance means no architecture, no urban development, no industry, no commerce, no science, no art, not even poetry, that quintessentially Arab art form. They imagine that an Islamic government would silence poets and minstrels unless they confined their verses to religious exhortations or grammatical treatises. Indeed, for some, even the mere association of governance with morality evokes such a reaction. I recall a conversation with a certain doctorate holder in education, recently returned from America, who was speaking to me about American society. I remarked that while that society had its merits, my primary objection was that it utterly excluded morality from its considerations, regarding it as an irrelevant factor in life. He sprang up in passionate indignation and exclaimed, "If we are going to talk about morals, then let us return to life in tents." And it is with such a mindset that this esteemed professor was entrusted with training future generations of teachers in his Institute of Education, teachers who, in turn, would be responsible for shaping the minds of our children, whom we entrust to them with confidence and assurance. These people, as I have said, fail to distinguish between Islam's historical emergence and its essential system of governance. The Islamic system is not confined to the form of the early Muslim society. Rather, it encompasses every social structure that adheres to Islam's overarching vision of life. This system accommodates myriad expressions, evolving in accordance with the natural growth of societies and the ever-changing needs of the times, so long as the fundamental Islamic worldview governs their external and internal realities. One such expression is a civilization that embraces all that is wholesome in human advancement, all that is sound in scientific and intellectual progress, and all that befits a world that acknowledges its origin in the divine. It is this vision that we seek to realize when we declare our desire to revive an Islamic way of life governed by Islamic principles. Hardship and asceticism are not intrinsic to Islam, as some well-meaning yet misguided individuals assume. The austerity of early Islamic society was merely an economic condition during a particular phase of history. Encouraging patience in the face of such hardship was a necessity dictated by reality, lest people succumb to despair, lose their resolve, and falter in their struggle at a time when the call of Islam required perseverance and endurance. But beyond that initial phase, every individual is entitled to enjoy the blessings of life within the bounds of moderation, neither descending into extravagance nor becoming enslaved to desires, as is the case with that frivolous class of people who, in our time, are called the elite. Likewise, many confuse Islamic law itself with the historical development of Islamic jurisprudence, assuming that drawing legislation from the Sharia means adhering strictly to the legal rulings formulated in early times, rulings which, by their very nature, cannot suffice for addressing all the evolving needs of society across the ages. It is an amusing confusion indeed, for this sacred law, with all its flexibility and comprehensiveness, responded to the needs of Bedouin life, just as it later responded to the needs of statehood, in the era of Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and to the requirements of expansion in the era of Umar. Thereafter, it continued to accommodate the demands of civilization, so long as there remained vitality in the Islamic Ummah. And when the dynamism of the Ummah came to a halt, so too did the growth of jurisprudence. Yet, should life once again stir within this Ummah, the Islamic law, ever present, would rise to meet its renewed needs and evolving demands, for within it lies an expanse, a flexibility, and a comprehensiveness that knows no bounds. It is most unfortunate that the vast majority of those engaged in legislative affairs in Egypt today have received their entire education under the shadow of a foreign legal mindset, knowing but little, scarcely anything of the Islamic law. It is therefore difficult for them to conceive that the Islamic law possesses the capacity to provide the modern legislator with all that is required for the ever-changing realities of contemporary life. Some among this majority mock such a notion, but they are themselves the most deserving of ridicule, for theirs is a mockery born of ignorance and indolence, a scornful derision born of infatuation with a civilization in whose making they had no part, upon which they are but parasitic dependents. Had we possessed a vigilant legal consciousness, the 70 years of applying the French legal code would have sufficed for us to perceive the very conflict we speak of, the discord between the spirit of the law and the spirit of the people, the deep dissonance between its nature and the nature of the society upon which it was imposed, and the extent of its failure to convince the people of its justice. For had the people been convinced of the justice of the law, had its essence been in harmony with their own, then the phenomenon we have highlighted, the phenomenon of the masses rallying behind outlaws, regarding them as heroes worthy of admiration, protection and assistance, would never have come to be. The revival of Islamic law would ensure, first and foremost, the people's willing submission to the law, because it would grant them complete social justice, stand as a bulwark against tyrants and exploiters, and establish a society free from the afflictions that corrupt human nature, deprive people of trust, and spread among them anxiety, resentment and rebellion. And secondly, because such a law would be bound to their hearts by the power of faith, its spirit resonating with their own in the very depths of their being. The cooperation between the people and the authorities would stem from the realization that this cooperation is not merely to satisfy earthly rulers, but also to attain the pleasure of the sovereign of the heavens, and to uphold the justice decreed by the divine. Law, by its very nature, contains prohibitions and deterrents, preventing people from indulging in many of their cherished desires deeply rooted in their innate inclinations. Thus, for them to obey and respect it from the depths of their hearts, it must draw upon a force embedded deep within their beings. And there's no force more profound in the human soul than the power of faith, which alone can fortify and uphold the law, even as it restrains individuals from that which they find pleasurable and delightful. Yet Islam, in its profound consideration of the needs of both the individual and the community, in its attentiveness to the ever-changing realities of life and the evolving structures of civilization, possesses the means to accommodate these needs and demands with ease, flexibility and grace. However, it must be made abundantly clear that when we say that Islam has the capacity to keep pace with a modern and progressive society, we do not mean subjecting Islam, its principles and its laws, to the whims of transient masses or the fleeting impulses of popular desire, as a means of pandering to the people in the name of modernity and progress, in the manner of those who call themselves Egyptian Muslims, or those pygmies whom they celebrate in this age of diminutive men as liberals. The Church in America, too, once embraced the same understanding as these so-called modernists and progressives. It transformed from a house of worship into a hall of dance, from a sanctuary of purity into a temple of pleasure. I shall never forget that priest who, having completed his prayers and hymns, proceeded to lead his sons and daughters into the dance hall annexed to the church. He stood there, watching them with satisfaction as they moved in tightly embraced pairs, swaying to the melodies, under the glow of red, yellow and blue lights that cast an air of intense romance, setting young blood aflame. Then he stepped forward to the gramophone, selecting a record for his sons and daughters to dance to under his very gaze. He chose a song, a brazenly sensual duet between a young man and a woman returning from the cinema after midnight, as he holds her in his warm chamber, refusing to let her return home, for the night is cold. And after every verse, the refrain echoes, "But baby, it is cold outside." No, this is not what we mean at all. Rather, we envision a society that fulfills the legitimate demands of its time, evolving with its growth, while remaining wholly and humbly bound to the pure spirit of Islam and its steadfast principles that embody the loftiest ideals of true and righteous civilization, the civilization of man, not the lawlessness of beasts. The rule of clerics and dervishes. There are others who imagine that Islamic governance means the rule of clerics and dervishes. From where do they derive such a notion? From their shallow and incomplete education, and from the circumstances of our present age. But true, authentic Islam knows no such system, neither in its theoretical foundations nor in its historical reality. Even the distinctive attire of sheikhs and dervishes, this too has nothing to do with religion. There is no such thing as Islamic dress or non-Islamic dress. Islam has not prescribed any particular attire for its followers. Clothing is a regional matter, a mere historical custom. Muhammad, the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, did not wear a robe or a tunic or a cassock. He wore the garments of his people and his time. Likewise, Muslims in Persia wore Persian attire, and Muslims in Egypt wore Egyptian clothing. Why then should some Muslims distinguish themselves from others by their dress? Islam knows no clergy, no ecclesiastical hierarchy through which religious rites must be conducted. Jurisprudence in Islam is but a field of knowledge, akin to medicine, engineering, commerce, and all other branches of human learning. Yes, there exist official positions such as that of the judiciary. But Islam does not recognize a distinction between a judge of personal affairs who rules according to Islamic law and a judge of criminal and civil cases who rules by another law. Islam recognizes but one comprehensive law that governs penalties and civil matters, just as it governs marriage, divorce, and inheritance. All these rulings emanate from a unified vision that defines the various aspects of human activity. The one who assumes the role of judge, whether in all these matters or in a specialized field, is appointed not by virtue of religious ordination, but by virtue of his expertise in Islamic jurisprudence, just as a physician practices medicine based on his training and an engineer practices engineering based on his specialization. The judge in Islam is no cleric. He is but a Muslim who has mastered a branch of knowledge and thus is entrusted with a task he is qualified to perform, just as every person in life is entrusted with what they excel in. Even religious services such as leading the prayer are not in themselves salaried positions. No one is paid for merely leading the prayer in Islam unless he has another function within the mosque, such as teaching or overseeing its administration. The role of leading prayer is not reserved for a particular individual. Rather, the congregation is led by the most qualified among them, and their prayer remains valid whether performed in congregation or individually, except in the case of the Friday prayer. From all this, it is evident that there is no such thing in Islam as a clergy whose rule is to be feared if governance is returned to Islam. And history itself attests that legal scholarship, in and of itself, was never a qualification for leadership, even during the most glorious ages of Islamic rule. It was always expertise in a given field that determined one's suitability for a role, without regard to religious scholarship, even without regard to the highest virtue Islam recognizes among people, piety. Abu Bakr, the most discerning among the companions of the Messenger of God in the spirit of Islam, wrote to Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, whom the Messenger of God had called the trustee of this nation, saying, "In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. From the servant of God, Ibn Abi Quafar, to Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah. May the peace of God be upon you. Now then, I have appointed Khalid to lead the battle against the enemy in Syria. Do not oppose him, but listen to him and obey, for I have placed him above you, while knowing well that you are better than he and superior in faith. Yet I have thought that he possesses a certain acumen in warfare which you may not have. May God guide us and you to the path of righteousness." To those who fear, were Islam to rule that they might behold at the head of an army in battle, or in a department of chemistry, or forensic medicine, or the Ministry of Public Works or Finance, a bearded elder or a turbaned ascetic, merely because he has read books of jurisprudence and tradition, or has memorized texts, commentaries and glosses, or has mastered the recitations of religious litanies and prayers to such as these, let reassurance be given. For the historical reality of Islam, like its theoretical foundations, acknowledges only competence in the field of expertise. To each is a direction to which he turns. Islamic governance does not manifest merely because a religious faction assumes power, for Islam, as you see, knows no religious faction, but rather because Islamic law is enacted, because the idea of Islam reigns, and because its principles and systems shape the form of government and the structure of society. This is the essence of the matter. As for the type of governance Islam necessitates, it is a government based on consultation, shura. The Quran explicitly affirms this, and consult them in affairs, 3:159. And the Prophet has said, "Had I been to appoint anyone as leader without consulting the believers, I would have appointed Ibn Abd." Thus, the principle of consultation in governance and administration is established unequivocally, for even he, the Prophet, did not possess the authority to appoint a leader without the counsel of the believers. Yet the method of consultation is not defined by Islam in a fixed manner, for it is a procedural matter, subject to the needs of every era, its means, and its capacities in implementing the principle in every place and time. When the people of discernment, who represented the entire community, were gathered around the Prophet in Medina, the companions, he would consult them in matters where no divine revelation or legal text had been given, and he left them free to express their views and manage their worldly affairs, for they were more knowledgeable in such matters. By worldly affairs here is meant those concerns that do not pertain to legal or social rulings, but rather to practical expertise, such as the arts of warfare, agriculture, and the safeguarding of harvests. These are what we might call today purely scientific and technical matters. As for legislative matters concerning the human being, his soul, his intellect, his relationships with others, and the boundaries between his rights and duties, these are determined by scriptural texts and analogy, that is, by the codified Islamic laws or general principles and overarching ideas. What aligns with them belongs to them. Consultation remained confined to Medina as long as Medina represented the people of discernment. But when circumstances changed, the first caliph, Abu Bakr, expanded the scope of consultation and sought the counsel of the people of Mecca regarding the war in Syria. For the matter was a military campaign beyond the entire Arabian Peninsula, whose consequences would affect the people of Mecca as much as those of Medina. Thus, if in our present age the voice of the people is not represented solely by those residing in Cairo, nor in Alexandria, nor in any single city, then the method of consultation must ensure that the voices of all are heard. This is a procedural matter concerning execution. As for the principle itself, it is firmly established in Islam. What Islam insists upon is removing any constraints that render elections unrepresentative of the true will of the nation, so that the voter is not at the mercy of the landowner, the employer, or the ruler, as is often the case today. The ruler in Islam derives his authority from a single source, the will of the governed. The bay'ah, the pledge of allegiance freely given, is the sole legitimate means of assuming leadership. The historical reality of Islam was built upon this principle. The caliphates of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali were all founded upon absolute choice. This does not contradict Umar's recommendation that the caliphate be confined to one among 6 men, for that was counsel to the Muslims, not a binding command. Had the Muslims chosen someone outside that group, their choice would have been valid. But those 6 were, by unanimous agreement, the most qualified, and thus the people freely selected one of them, not by Umar's decree, but by their own consent and approval. When the Umayyads deviated from this fundamental Islamic principle of governance, it was restored by the 5th rightly guided caliph Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz. He returned authority to the nation, which alone must choose its rulers freely, willingly, and without coercion. Ascending the pulpit, he declared, "O people, I have been afflicted with this responsibility without my own deliberation, without seeking it, and without the consultation of the Muslims. I hereby relieve you of your pledge to me. Choose for yourselves whom you will." But the people responded, "We have chosen you, O Commander of the Faithful, and we are content with you. So govern us with justice and blessing." Thus authority was restored to its rightful course. There can be no governance without consultation, consent, and acceptance. The ruler in Islam commands obedience only insofar as he upholds and implements the Islamic law. Nothing else grants him legitimacy. This is his covenant with the people. If he fails to implement the divine law, he forfeits his claim to obedience. As the Prophet said, "Listen and obey, even if an Ethiopian slave with a raisin-like head is appointed over you, so long as he upholds the Book of God." It is clear from this hadith that obedience is contingent upon upholding God's book. It is not unconditional submission to the ruler's will, nor is it perpetual obedience even if he abandons the divine law. Thus, Islamic governance is established not by the presence of a particular class of scholars and ascetics in power, as many mistakenly believe, but by a commitment to justice, consultation, and the rule of law. And let me further reassure those who fear that an Islamic government would bring forth madmen and dervishes to fill its offices. Let them be assured that such a government would not merely refrain from harbouring these groups, but would also not tolerate their idleness and unproductivity. It would mobilize them for productive labor, so that they might contribute to the nation's well-being. Islamic governance will not allow dervishes to continue their dervish ways, nor will it permit Sufi sheikhs to live off the offerings of the people. Islam demands that every individual engage in work for which he is duly compensated. There is no wage without effort, no reward without labor. Prayer and supplication are personal acts of devotion, not social enterprises. As for the chanting of litanies and the recitation of invocations, these are pastimes of idle ages, unknown to eras of vigour and action. Feudal societies are the ones that sustain idle sheikhs and wandering dervishes, granting them patronage and recognizing their existence because such figures serve as opiates, numbing the masses to their deprivation and suffering. But an Islamic government which combats feudalism and shields people from exploitation has no need for such instruments of sedation. It will direct these idle multitudes toward labor, create opportunities for work, and govern for the well-being of all, not merely for the privileged at the expense of the dispossessed. And then no longer shall the idle sheikhs and indolent dervishes be the masters of his age. Rather, they shall be its outcasts, unless they change what lies within themselves, transform their means of livelihood, and labour alongside those who toil in the fields of fruitful endeavour, in the field of life itself. The tyranny of rule. Many among the thinkers and men of art tremble at the thought of an Islamic government erecting gallows for them, casting them into the flames, or hurling them into the depths of dungeons. And why? Because, they say, a theocratic government is, by its very nature, despotic and unjust. It stifles freedoms, chokes the breath of thought, narrows the horizons, and arrests the faculties of reason. But whence has this wretched, joyless image of Islamic rule and governance arisen, O wise and learned men? It has emerged from the annals of the Inquisition in the Dark Ages, those tribunals that burned scholars at the stake, impaled them upon spikes, and cast them into pits of serpents and vipers. It has also arisen from the regimes that in the present age rule in the name of religion in certain Muslim lands. Yet not one of these governments has anything to do with Islam. They do not derive their authority from Islam, rather they thrive upon rampant ignorance, intellectual decline, and the stagnation of thought in the lands where they took root, whether in ancient or recent times. Bestow upon these subjugated peoples knowledge, progress, and enlightenment. Grant them an understanding of their faith, and the veil shall fall from their eyes. They shall perceive that Islam stands not with the tyrannical rulers, but against them. Shall we then, merely because a despotic ruler claims to rule in the name of religion, condemn this mode of governance and banish it from the realm of existence? If so, what shall we say of democratic rule, the very system under which Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan are governed today, all of them, by the grace of God, adhering to the latest constitutional and parliamentary models? Is this what is called constitutional democracy? When the machinery of the state exists solely to serve the interests of capital, while millions languish in hunger, nakedness and disease, with no guardian and no defender, is this what is called constitutional democracy? When the mere whim of a police officer suffices to accuse any passerby of a crime, seize him, slap him, kick him, hurl insults at him, and drag him through the mire should he dare resist, only to haul him off to the police station where a report is filed against him. And all this before he is even presented to the prosecution, before he stands trial, before it is determined whether he is guilty or innocent after due investigation. Is this what is called constitutional democracy? When such things transpire as those recounted by the valiant writer Muhammad Ali al-Tahir in his comprehensive work, The Huckstep Detention Camp, where he writes, "Such was the terror that overtook the mother of Ali Ammar, the student of law at Farouk University and one of the detainees, that she and her daughters sought refuge beneath their beds, fleeing the hail of rapid-fire bullets. But the beds were overturned, and the commander of the forces bellowed at them, rendering them mute with fear. For 3 hours the house was ransacked, sacred and cherished possessions were defiled, tiles were ripped from the floor, wardrobes were smashed, mattresses and blankets were torn apart. The political police, with their zealous fervour, transformed the home into a heap of refuse before the eyes of its children, its women, its elders. The entire family was then herded off to the detention camp, beaten with sticks and whips from the threshold of their home to the gates of the prison. The women returned to their mother, a mother rendered speechless, stunned, gazing in horror at her son, her husband, her kin, all of them lashed before her eyes. But they found the poor woman stricken with paralysis, unable to utter a word, a condition that afflicts her to this day. And the forensic doctor, in his report to the esteemed court, recorded that Ali Ammar, the law student at Farouk University, accused in the military case, had had his fingernails torn out. Is this what is called constitutional democracy? When a man stands before a court and recounts what was published in one of Egypt's leading daily newspapers, saying, "Then they brought in Abdel Fattah Tawat, the third defendant in the case concerning the assault on Professor Hamed Gouda. The court seated him on a chair. In response to questioning by Mr. Hassan al-Ashmawi, he declared that he had never admitted to anything during the investigation, and that the torture had so shattered him that he lost all sense of himself. With a trembling, feeble voice he recounted the horrors of his torment, how General Talat Bey had threatened him with dismemberment should he refuse to confess, telling him, 'The country is under martial law. he continued. They took me to a room with officers Al-Ashri and Farouk Kamal. They stripped me of my clothes and beat me from 9 in the evening until 4 in the morning. They divided themselves into 4 groups each, composed of 12 soldiers and an officer. They placed my feet in the stocks and thrashed me until the very stocks broke. Then they used the whips of the camel riders. When I lost consciousness, Talat Bey said to me, "This is only the first round, more shall follow." They took me to Ibrahim Abdelhadi Pasha, who said, "I have orders to finish you off." Then he commanded that my torture continue. The torment escalated in 4 degrees, beatings with sticks and whips, then branding with hot iron. They brought forth a searing iron rod, but Officer Mahmoud Talat interceded, saying to the others, "He is my friend, and he will confess to everything." Then they left me to sleep on the asphalt, but they would pound on the door to keep sleep from my eyes, not that I could rest upon any part of my body, for all of it was aflame with pain. They demanded my confession, threatening to violate me if I did not comply. One of them advanced toward me with that intent. I said to him, "I know I cannot resist you. You may commit this crime and escape the laws of men, but know this: God shall not leave this sin unpunished." At that, he recoiled. The torture persisted. My nerves were shattered. When I sought refuge with Ismail Awad Bey, he would ring the bell and summon the guards, saying, "Take him away, mute him completely." Ibrahim Abdelhadi Pasha visited me 4 times, saying, "I shall destroy you and your family. I am the military ruler." Even the Attorney General Mahmoud Mansour Pasha, when I pleaded my case before him, merely responded, "I know everything," and left me to my fate. Then, as the accused completed this testimony, his body convulsed, his eyes darted wildly, and he collapsed in a fit of nervous agitation. A tormented, gasping breath escaped him, moving many in the courtroom to tears. The police officers rushed to sprinkle water upon his face. A physician among those present hastened to his side, and they carried him away. Mr. Mukhtar Abdel-Alim requested that this incident be recorded in the session minutes, and the court acceded, adding that the fit had persisted for a considerable time. If all this, and much more besides, chronicled in the annals of every political detainee in modern Egyptian history, has indeed transpired, should we then declare that constitutional democracy, having bred such horrors, must be cast aside, just as they say Islamic rule must be abandoned because of the crimes committed in its name in ages past and in certain lands today? The true criterion by which any system must be judged lies in its fundamental principles and intrinsic authenticity. If these principles and foundations are disregarded, whether due to ignorance, moral decay, or any other factors, then those who are sincere in their pursuit of truth must declare with unwavering clarity, the essence of this system is being neglected, and it must be restored to its original foundations. The call for such a restoration will be powerful, for it does not arise from mere conjecture, but from a recognized and acknowledged reality, one that has, however, been cast aside in practice. Had the exclusion of Islam from governance been justified by the claim that Islam, by its very nature, fosters tyranny in rulers or compels the governed to submit in passive servitude, then such an argument might have carried some weight. But Islam is, in essence, the very antithesis of despotism. It is the religion that established a society in which there is neither master nor slave, neither privileged elite nor subjugated masses. It is a system wherein Abu Bakr and Umar, the 2 closest companions of the Prophet, could be placed under the command of a former slave, without either of them or anyone else finding this surprising or unnatural. A system in which the son of an ordinary man from Egypt could strike the son of the noblest, the son of Egypt's governor, Amr ibn al-As, by order of the caliph and in full view of the people. A system that warns those who accept humiliation and subjugation of a grievous punishment. As for those whom the angels take away while they wrong themselves, the angels will say, "In what condition were you?" They will reply, "We were oppressed in the land." The angels will say, "Was not the earth of God vast enough for you to migrate therein?" It is these whose refuge shall be hell. What an evil destination. Quran 4:97. And it urges them to fight for their rights. Whoever is killed while defending his right is a martyr. It even warns those who remain silent in the face of a tyrannical ruler without resisting him. Whoever sees a ruler acting tyrannically, violating the sanctities of God, breaking his covenant, opposing the way of his messenger, and committing injustice and oppression among God's servants, yet does not challenge him with word or deed, then it is incumbent upon God to cast him into the same abode as that ruler. Shall we then believe that this system is one that leads to the tyranny of rulers and the subjugation of the ruled? Or are such fears nothing more than baseless fabrications and distortions? What remains then is the fear that those entrusted with implementing Islamic governance may themselves be narrow-minded, rigid in thought. Yet I do not believe that this fear arises from a genuine understanding of Islam, but rather from an association fostered in the minds of many between Islam and the image of elderly sheikhs and wandering dervishes. If those who harbour such fears come to realize that these individuals are neither the standard bearers of Islamic governance nor its rightful representatives, indeed, that they would be cast aside unless they transform themselves and engage in productive work beyond mere prayers, chants and invocations, then this grim image of Islamic rule ought to fade away. Unless, of course, the accusation is not against the representatives of Islam, but against Islam itself. But could such an accusation truly be levelled against this great faith? To this day, no one who possesses even a basic knowledge of Islam has dared to accuse it of intellectual rigidity or narrow-mindedness. As for those who speak without knowledge, they are unworthy of serious attention, for they fail to uphold even the most fundamental standards of reasoned discourse. Islam has never sought to impose itself upon the realm of pure science or practical knowledge, for it considers these to be the domain of worldly affairs. The Prophet himself laid down a fundamental principle in this regard: you are better acquainted with the affairs of your world. Thus, Islam has entirely distanced itself from the domain into which the medieval church had intruded, persecuting scientists, imprisoning them, and burning them at the stake for the crime of engaging in scientific inquiry. Yet, when it comes to matters of society, worship, and all that pertains to the spiritual and intellectual well-being of humanity, Islam maintains a clear stance. Anything that does not explicitly legalize what God has forbidden or prohibit what he has made lawful remains open to discussion. It is a matter of opinion, subject to debate, where truth and falsehood may be explored through reasoned dialogue. Islam safeguards the right of individuals to express such views, provided they do not amount to outright unequivocal disbelief so clear and manifest that it leaves no room for doubt or interpretation. As for the legal penalties, hudud, prescribed by Islam, these belong to an entirely different category. They pertain to crimes that threaten the sanctity, dignity and welfare of society. If one wishes to denounce them on grounds of presumed cruelty, invoking the language of civilization and barbarism, then that is a separate matter, one that warrants its own discussion. The legal punishments in Islam, such as amputating the hand of a thief, stoning the adulterer, or flogging the fornicator and the habitual drunkard, may, at first glance, appear severe, but this perception arises only when one fails to comprehend Islam's overarching philosophy and its profound concern for the collective well-being of society. Islam does not enforce these penalties arbitrarily. It only applies them when no reasonable justification remains for committing the crime and when no ambiguity surrounds the act itself. It does not amputate the hand of a thief who steals out of necessity to feed himself or his family. If compelling social or personal circumstances drive a person to theft, then no punishment is imposed. Indeed, in such cases, the blame may instead fall upon those who created the conditions that led to the crime. This was precisely the approach taken by Caliph Umar when he refrained from punishing a group of servants who had stolen a camel because their master had failed to provide them with sufficient food. Instead, he fined the master double the value of the camel. Likewise, during the famine of the Year of Ashes, he suspended the enforcement of theft-related penalties altogether. And so the adulterer is stoned if witnesses testify to his guilt in a state of unequivocal certainty, or he is flogged, yet Islam does not grant anyone the right to violate another's privacy, to climb over his walls, or to spy upon him. Hence, the adulterer who is convicted by witnesses is not one who committed his sin in secrecy, but rather one who engaged in lewdness in a manner so brazen that it could be observed by others. Such a one is not merely a sinner, but a corrupter of society, a spreader of vice, and indeed God abhors this and condemns it. Indeed, those who love to spread immorality among the believers shall suffer a grievous torment in this world and the hereafter. Quran 24:19. As for those who fall into this sin in secrecy and later confess out of remorse, seeking purification, Islam treats them with profound compassion, searching for any possible doubt that may absolve them, so as to spare these tormented souls from punishment. And what further confirms that these penalties are not merely punitive but preventative, aimed at safeguarding society from the spread of corruption, is that the punishment of flogging is also prescribed for another group, those who, through slander and false accusations, seek to tarnish the honour of chaste believing women. And those who accuse chaste women and do not bring forth witnesses flog them with 80 lashes and never again accept their testimony, for they are indeed transgressors. Quran 24:4. The same principle applies to the punishment for drinking alcohol. A person is flogged if he is caught drinking openly. But if he does so in secrecy unseen by others, then no one has the right to violate his privacy or spy upon him. However, if he flaunts his sin, openly defying the moral fabric of society, then the community has the right to protect itself from such blatant disregard for its ethical order. But if he remains discreet, then his reckoning is with his conscience and his Creator. Such matters Islam entrusts not to human punishment but to the awakening of the soul. Here we may borrow a thought from Sayyid Qutb, recorded in his book Man Between Materialism and Islam, regarding Islamic punishments. In essence, he explains, Islam first seeks to eliminate all the conditions that might drive an individual to crime, addressing the causes before the crime itself occurs. Thus, when a crime is committed, it is not out of necessity or compulsion, but out of defiant arrogance and reckless choice. Only then do its penalties, however severe they may seem, become justified, for Islam does not lie in wait for people's missteps, nor does it seek to entrap them in legal snares. But if all preventive measures fail, then treatment becomes inevitable. This is clear. Yet there are those whose hearts are diseased, who interpret these safeguards within Islamic law as signs of its weakness or lack of seriousness. Such an interpretation is nothing but shallow ignorance, a reckless superficiality that is unbefitting of the dignity of true knowledge, the gravity of scholarly inquiry, and the earnestness required in addressing such profound matters. And now let it be known to the sincere among thinkers, artists, and all those who cherish intellectual freedom, Islamic governance will not deliver them to the gallows or the dungeons. It will not suppress their thoughts, shatter their pens, or cast them beyond the pale of its protection and care. Let them not be deceived by the hollow cries of certain religious figures today who raise their voices against books and ideas as though they were defending the faith. These cries are but a lucrative trade in the present age, a profitable craft, for they serve the interests of a feudal system that maintains them as guardians of its injustices and crimes. And to justify their role in the eyes of the masses, they periodically unleash these empty clamourings. But when governance is truly in the hands of Islam, these individuals will find themselves without occupation. They, along with the idle aristocrats, the financiers who live off usury, the bureaucrats who clutter government offices, the dreamers in cafes and taverns, the drifters in the streets, and those who bask idly in the sun by the granaries, all of them alike in their idleness and stagnation will be drawn into the stream of productive labour. Some among them may have been reluctant loafers, others mere indolent slackers, and yet others exploiters devoid of conscience. And when the masses are propelled into the realm of active, meaningful work, crimes warranting punishment will become rare, mere anomalies within the social fabric, as is the case in every community. The alleged ambiguity of Islamic texts. Some innocent but ignorant souls believe the claims of those who malign Islam, alleging ambiguity in its legal texts. They are misled because some of these detractors bear the title of scholars, and so doubt creeps into their hearts, leading them to fear that the interpretability of the texts will cast them into a state of confusion, unable to discern the clear foundations of the laws that govern them. This ignorance of Islam is what sustains such doubts in people's minds. Moreover, the complex commentaries, footnotes, and interpretations that the religious institutions of past ages fixated upon and which still dominate their studies today only add to this confusion. The scholars of such institutions, instead of returning to the pristine and simple sources of Islam, have buried its clarity beneath layers of scholastic entanglements. Thus, one may indeed sympathize with the common people who, confronted with this vast labyrinth of commentaries, feel lost. There is yet another route to this doubt, one unknown to the innocent, but exploited by the malicious. It is the comprehensiveness and breadth of Islamic principles. Instead of recognizing this as a virtue, they portray it as a peril. But let it be clear, the foundational principles of Islam are not found in these dense annotations and commentaries that religious institutions have long dwelled upon, stifling the minds of their students and consuming their years in fruitless debates. I've previously written an entire book, Social Justice in Islam, spanning some 300 pages, and another, World Peace and Islam, of nearly 200 pages without once finding it necessary to delve into these secondary sources. The original fountains of Islam, the Quran, the Sunnah, the biography of the Prophet, and the historical record, were more than sufficient for my research and will remain sufficient for all who seek knowledge. Indeed, the four great legal schools of Islam themselves derived all their rulings from these primary sources. These sources remain accessible to many. Yes, differences may arise in minor details and applications, but this is true of every legal system in the world. Jurists and scholars debate interpretations, yet no one calls for abandoning those legal frameworks simply because scholars have not reached unanimous agreement on every aspect. As for the breadth and flexibility of Islamic principles, this pertains not to the fixed legal punishments, but to the broader, evolving aspects of governance and societal affairs. For instance, Islam establishes the principle of shura, consultation, in governance, but does not dictate a specific mechanism for its implementation, just as modern constitutions may declare a government to be parliamentary, while leaving the specifics of election laws to legislation. Similarly, Islam establishes the principle that legal punishment should be averted in cases of doubt, yet it leaves the determination of such cases to the discretion of qualified judges and legislators. It mandates resistance against an oppressive faction until it submits to justice. Yet it entrusts the determination of what constitutes such oppression to those entrusted with governance, much like the United Nations today, which determines when an act of aggression warrants collective intervention. The lawful is clear, and the unlawful is clear. As for those who deliberately twist legal texts to serve their own ends, such distortions are possible in any legal system at any time. Do we not see that each successive government interprets laws differently, sometimes exploiting them in ways never intended by their framers? Should we then call for the abolition of all laws because a tyrant may misuse them? Why then is it only Islamic law that is accused when it is misinterpreted by despots? This accusation is unjust and stands upon no sound foundation. The harem. A persistent misconception has clung to this religion, one that stands at odds with its essence and teachings, as distant from its historical reality as from the truth itself. This is the misconception of the harem. The words haremlik and selamlik are of Turkish origin, indicating that this system arose within the Islamic world, but not from Islam itself. And I do not think that anyone would accuse the Turks of being the original interpreters of Islam, nor were they among the companions of the Prophet or the early successors. Islam's elevation of women was nothing short of revolutionary for its time, and even today it remains a noble and humane step forward, one which Western civilization has only exceeded in the freedom of reckless abandon. Many women fear that should Islam return to governance, they would be reduced to bondage or imprisoned within the confines of a harem. Yet this fear is baseless, for Islam knows no such origins. What we do know and affirm with certainty is that no virtuous woman need fear Islam or its rule, for Islam has granted her a vast and dignified freedom, one that suffices any honourable person in their pursuit of meaningful contribution to society. Islam has given her the right to own property and earn wealth through lawful means. It has granted her the freedom to choose her own husband without coercion or compulsion. It has allowed her to enter and leave her home freely, so long as she dresses in a manner that preserves dignity, one that does not inflame desires or expose her to the whims of lust. Yes, indeed, Islam forbade her from emerging before men in the garb of an evening reveller, from casting coquettish glances and offering wanton laughter. If this is what some call freedom, then let them fear Islam and its rule. As for those who prattle about women's liberation merely as a pretext to exploit women, those whose pens drip with moral decay, such people know their aims well. Their motives are well understood by the dens of vice that welcome them, those gatherings where they are invited to debauched festivities in which human dignity is cast aside, and men and women alike are reduced to beasts in the wilderness. These licentious assemblies, where humanity is stripped of its essence, where man and woman are reduced to mere male and female, are unknown to Islam. In the time of Muhammad, the messenger of this faith, women attended the mosque for prayer, engaged in trade in the marketplace, and even accompanied men in battle to encourage and support them. If in later ages of tyranny and despotism, women were reduced to mere commodities, this was only a reflection of those times, just as men themselves were reduced to servitude. It was not Islam that commanded sultans to cast men into pits filled with serpents, nor was it Islam that decreed women be confined within the walls of the harem. Rather, these were the injustices of history wrongs that victimized both men and women alike. Likewise, freedom does not consist in the brazen exposure of thighs and bosoms at nocturnal revelries. Such spectacles are nothing but spiritual depravity masquerading as aristocracy, and servitude to the flesh masquerading as liberty. Thus, when the governance of Islam is restored, it will return to women their noble freedom, saving them from both the backwardness that still lingers in certain circles and from the debauchery that has emerged from the ranks of the so-called aristocracy. Islam will rescue the very soul of humanity, whether it is shackled by repression and injustice in the harem or degraded by vulgarity and cheapness in the salon. In the former, women are humiliated by oppression, in the latter by their own commodification. There is no fear of Islam for any virtuous woman who seeks to live with dignity and engage in meaningful, honourable work. But as for those who find no place for themselves within such bounds, let them indeed tremble at the prospect of Islamic rule. Bigotry against minorities. There remains one final misconception, one I dislike addressing, yet it is whispered by some, hinted at by others, and even used as a pretext by certain opportunists seeking petty gains and narrow interests. It is the question of minorities under Islamic governance and the notion of national identity in a state governed by Islamic law. To even entertain a fear of Islam's rule over its minorities is, in my view, an injustice that should not be tolerated. For no religion in the world nor any system of governance has safeguarded the liberties, dignities and rights of its minorities as Islam has throughout its long history. Indeed, no regime has ever indulged its minorities with such gracious tolerance, not only those who shared its language and homeland, but also those who were entirely foreign to its people. And what was Islam's reward for its fairness and benevolence? Persecution of its followers in lands ruled by other faiths and under every form of governance, whether ancient or modern. This alone renders any discussion about the supposed nationalism of Islamic rule both absurd and detestable, lacking any foundation in truth, reality or history, let alone the spirit of fairness that should govern the conduct of citizens in any Islamic land. To settle this matter, I shall take but a single period from Islamic history, one that by all expectations should have been among the most intolerant and severe. It was a time shrouded in darkness, ruled by the Turks, and yet even then the treatment of non-Muslim minorities and conquered lands tells a tale that refutes all claims of oppression. Rather than my own words, I shall let a Christian European author speak on the subject, drawing from his assessment of that era. In his book, The Preaching of Islam, Sir Thomas Walker Arnold writes, translated by Hassan Ibrahim Hassan, Abdul Majid Abidin, and Ismail al-Nahrawi, pp. 138-139. The treatment that the Ottoman emperors extended to their Christian subjects, at least 2 centuries after their conquest of Greek lands, demonstrates a degree of tolerance that had been unknown in all of Europe until that time. Indeed, the Calvinists of Hungary and Transylvania, as well as the Unitarians of Transylvania, often preferred submission to the Turks over falling into the hands of the intolerant Habsburg dynasty. In Silesia, Protestants looked upon Turkey with longing eyes, wishing eagerly that they could purchase their religious freedom under Islamic rule. When the Jews of Spain fled persecution in great numbers, they found no refuge except in Turkey. Likewise, the Cossacks belonging to the sect of the Old Believers, who suffered persecution at the hands of the Russian Orthodox Church, discovered in the Sultan's dominions a tolerance denied to them by their Christian brethren. Perhaps it was for this reason that Macarius, the Patriarch of Antioch in the 17th century, found solace in his lamentations over the horrific massacres committed by the Catholic Poles against the Orthodox Russians. He wrote, "We have all wept bitterly for the thousands of martyrs slaughtered over the past 40 or 50 years by those accursed heretics, the enemies of religion. Their victims may number 70 or 80,000. O treacherous ones, O wretched souls, O hearts hardened like stone! What had the nuns and women done? What crime had the young girls, the boys and the small children committed that they should be murdered? And why do I call them the accursed Poles? Because they proved themselves more depraved and more ferocious than the idol-worshipping pagans in their cruelty toward their fellow Christians. And they imagine that by such deeds they will erase the name of orthodoxy from existence. May God preserve the rule of the Turks forever and ever." What have the Muslims faced in times such as these? Nay, what do they still endure to this very day? Savage crimes are committed against them in Ethiopia, our neighbouring land, in Malaya under British rule, in Russia, Yugoslavia and all the communist lands whose propagandists and the gullible among our own brethren claim to be free of religious bias, asserting that they hold no enmity against Islam, and in India, whose ambassador in Egypt we chastised because our own ambassador in Pakistan was said to have spoken a word of truth concerning Kashmir. Nay, these monstrous crimes are not only committed against Muslims in foreign lands, but even within their own homes in North Africa at the hands of France, in southern Sudan at the hands of Britain, and in every place where colonialism has set foot, even until now. All the allegations levelled against the rule of Islam are but echoes of certain Armenian massacres perpetrated by the late Ottoman Turks. Yet these massacres were not born of religious fanaticism. Rather, they had a political character. For these elements the Armenians were a thorn, ever used to pierce the Ottoman state in its time of weakness, incited by Russia or Europe for political reasons stemming from a crusading spirit. Moreover, what befell the Christian Armenians befell the Muslim Arabs of Syria twice over, under similar political circumstances. Both these atrocities were carried out by the basest elements within the Ottoman state, elements naturally inclined to bloodshed, cruelty and crime, who made no distinction in their brutality between Muslim and non-Muslim alike. Such men had no true understanding of Islam, nor of anything else. When governance returns to Islam, it shall proceed upon its noble and magnanimous principles, principles none can deny. The status and rights of minorities will remain unchanged. They shall continue to enjoy the very same rights they hold today, and let those who speak on this matter remember that in the 49 states of the United States of America, not a single governor is Catholic merely because the majority there are Protestants, and both are Christian, differing only in sect. Let them also remember that the persecution of Muslims in Ethiopia has reached such extremes that a Muslim debtor, should he fail to repay his debt to a Christian, is reduced to slavery merely because the ruling power belongs to Christians, even though Muslims constitute the numerical majority. What argument, then, can any man raise against Islamic governance regarding minorities? Modesty alone should suffice to silence such claims. Indeed, I loathe even discussing this subject, for every discourse upon it is but an ugly slander unworthy of regard. Enmities against Islamic rule. A moment ago we addressed the innocent souls whose minds have been clouded by doubts concerning Islamic governance, those who fear it and hesitate before it, not out of hatred, but out of ignorance. It is our duty to dispel these doubts, to lift the veils from their eyes, and to engage them in discourse with wisdom and kindness, for they are victims of ignorance, not perpetrators of malice. Yet these innocents are but prey to another groups, indeed, who are far from sharing their innocence or naivety. These others scheme against Islam with deliberate intent, portraying it to the ignorant in the most terrifying and grotesque forms, all for a calculated purpose and a well-defined aim. It is our duty to unveil these cunning deceivers before the unsuspecting, to expose the dark schemes hidden behind their curtains of subterfuge. Islamic governance has many enemies, both within and without. Among them are the cunning and the strong, as well as the feeble and the foolish. Yet all of them unite in a common cause, the exclusion of Islam from governance. They oppose the return of Islamic rule through various arguments, employing diverse logic and adopting differing tones and rhythms, all blending into a single clamour that may deceive the unwary into believing there is substance behind it. Let us then examine the nature of these enmities. The enmity of the Crusaders. Christianity in Europe and America has ceased to be a faith in the true sense. It has become a banner under which their nations rally a nationalistic symbol rather than a religious creed. When they call today for the defense of Christian civilization against the onslaught of communism, just as they once did against fascism and Nazism, it is not Christian doctrine they seek to defend, but Christian nations as homelands and ethnic groups. Christianity in their hands is but a cloak used to inflame the fervour of Christian lands everywhere. This explains the increasing moral and social decay in Christian societies, flagrant violations of Christian teachings at a time when the cry for the preservation of Christian civilization grows ever louder. With such an understanding of the matter, there is no mystery in the West's simultaneous abandonment of Christian ethics within their own societies and their fierce hostility toward non-Christian nations, especially the lands of Islam. There is no contradiction here, no perplexing enigma. It is but a masterful play staged for the gullible and the simple-minded among the followers of other faiths, above all, the Muslims. The West whispers to these heedless souls that religion is but a secondary concern, of no real consequence in governance, pointing to their own abandonment of religious constraints as proof. And so our misguided brethren echo this call, following its lead, and thus they bring ruin upon their own houses with their own hands, not with the hands of their cunning foes. All the while the entire Western world conspires against Islam, harbouring toward it nothing but enmity and malice. The Crusades have not ended except in the hearts and minds of the Muslims. In the Christian world, however, they remain ablaze. They hold a prominent place in the politics and consciousness of the Western nations, manifesting in various aspects of life. And with a blindness unmatched in history, we, the Muslims, assist them in their relentless war against us. The living Crusaders have never forgotten that Jerusalem was the prize for which the Crusades were waged. When Marshal Allenby entered Jerusalem during the Great War, he could not restrain the Crusaders' spirit burning within his blood, within the blood of every Crusader. And so he declared with unveiled triumph, "Now the Crusades are ended." And when the realities of colonial policy and the material facts on the ground dictated that Palestine should remain in the hands of its rightful inhabitants, the Arabs, its indigenous people, the crusading spirit stirred once more, this time under the guise of a Jewish homeland. Thus it led to the latest catastrophe, carried out under the very eyes of Britain and America, with their weapons and wealth. Even communism, which claims to eradicate religion from its considerations, joins hands with them, except when it comes to Islam, which it wages war against openly, not in the name of crusadism, but for its own interests, as we shall see. And the simpletons among us say, these are but colonial intrigues and personal ambitions. They fail to perceive that the crusading spirit lurks behind colonial policy as well, fanning its flames and strengthening its resolve. Only old Jerusalem remains in Arab hands, Muslim hands, after all. And here the United Nations steps in, seeking to return this land once more to crusader rule, not under the banner of crusadism, but under the guise of internationalization. It finds, in the petty rivalries between the Arab states, and even among the royal houses of these wretched nations, ample encouragement and support. And then, from the policymakers of these insignificant states, it finds a response veiled in the guise of national policy. The Crusaders and their fear of Islam. The Crusaders know, and the frankest among them openly admit, as I myself have heard with my own ears in America, that Islam is the only faith they truly fear. They do not dread Buddhism, nor Hinduism, nor even Judaism, for all these are but national religions confined to their own peoples, harbouring no aspiration to extend beyond their native followers. Moreover, they consider these faiths to be less advanced than Christianity. But Islam, as they themselves describe it, is a faith that moves, that surges forward, that expands of its own accord without any external force propelling it, and therein lies the danger it poses in their eyes. For this reason they deem it necessary to guard against it, to resist it, to combat it with all their might. And yet we in the East, in our heedlessness, fail to grasp the sheer magnitude of the missionary efforts undertaken by Europe and America to spread Christianity across the world, both in its remotest jungles and its most populated cities alike. We are oblivious to the fact that the Catholic Church alone maintains nearly 4,000 missionary expeditions, dispersed across the globe, reaching into the darkest recesses of the Congo and the hidden valleys of Tibet, armed with inexhaustible funds. These efforts are not carried out by the missionaries alone. Rather, they rely heavily on native collaborators in various lands, assuming diverse forms and disguises, using many names and avenues of which religious garb is but one. In Egypt, for instance, men such as Jurji Zaidan, the founder of Dar al-Hilal, and Salama Musa, the journalist, have served as crucial emissaries of this missionary endeavour. They have found fertile ground for their work in the heedlessness of Egyptians and Easterners alike, including both newspaper owners and their readers who unwittingly provide them with the very platform that fully fledged missionary organizations could never have secured. And all this is done under the banner of culture, literature, and journalism. Governments, too, lend their support to these missions, for behind the banner of Christianity lie political and economic ambitions. These governments regard Christianity as a national flag, spreading its shadow over these lands, as we have already mentioned. And the only faith that stands in defiance of these efforts, the only force that obstructs their path, is Islam alone. This is stated plainly in their reports, and at times even their more candid figures admit it openly. These crusaders understand that Islam is inseparable from its system of governance. It cannot manifest in its complete and powerful form upon this earth, except under a rule that translates its creed into law, that safeguards it, that defends it against its foes. Thus they wage war upon the prospect of Islam reclaiming its governance, a war relentless and unyielding. They engage in this battle with their influence and their strength, just as they do through the agency of our own fools and those among us whose interests make them fear the rule of Islam. At the same time that Europe and America deny Islam the right to govern even a single corner of the earth, to establish a state that raises its banner, implements its vision, and enforces its laws, there arise among us their echoing voices, crying out in the Islamic lands they have colonized, proclaiming that the age has passed when any state could be founded upon religion. Yet in that very same moment, the state of Israel emerges like a thorn among us. It is built upon religion alone. For Judaism is not a nationality but a creed. It gathers within its fold the Russian, the German, the Pole, the American, the Egyptian, the Yemeni, every scattered soul who walks this earth, regardless of race or origin. And upon Judaism alone does Israel rest, supported by Britain, financed by America. As for communist Russia, let us set its role in this tragedy aside for now. For though it denounces religion with the fiercest of voices, though it rejects the very idea of a state founded upon faith with the utmost vehemence, all these lofty principles evaporate, dispersing like mist, when the spectre of self-interest looms upon the horizon. What Islamic governance suffers at the hands of Crusader hostility in Egypt, Pakistan now faces in its struggle over Kashmir with India. Yet the simpletons among us fail to recognize that it is the crusading spirit that dictates the policies of these Christian nations, seeking instead to attribute their actions to other causes. It is the American propaganda machinery in the East that undertakes the task of advocating for India, with American funds fueling its influence, resonating clearly in the press of the East. And why? Because India is not Muslim, because it stands in conflict with the first Muslim state to rise in the East, and because the majority of those who wield power in the American government are graduates of missionary institutions. This was a truth confided to me by an English professor I met in America, one who enumerated for me the names of dozens of prominent figures within the US State Department and diplomatic corps. And he did not share this revelation out of pure goodwill. For as I later discovered, he was among the operatives of British intelligence, one of those whose concern it was to ensure that the Eastern peoples never placed too much trust in America's intentions. This revelation prompted me to question his statements, and so I sought to verify them through other means. Islam must not be allowed to govern. This is the will of the crusading world, and we in turn are expected to submit, to accept without question what the Crusaders whisper into our ears, both in the East and the West, in our naivete and heedlessness, all in the name of freedom and enlightenment. But who among the dwarfs of our age shall awaken to the truth? Who will rise to convince them that they remain still nothing more than dwarfs? The enmity of the colonizers. It is difficult to separate the hostility of Crusadism toward Islam from that of colonialism. For each feeds into the other, strengthens the other, justifies the other. Islam is a creed of dignity and self-respect. It resists colonialism whenever it awakens within the hearts of its followers. And the return of Islamic governance stirs this spirit with great intensity, disrupting the colonizers' designs of exploitation and subjugation. Islam forbids its adherents from submitting to any foreign rule, from accepting any legislation that contradicts the divine law of Islam. And this presents an insurmountable obstacle to colonialism. The colonizers are not as oblivious as our esteemed intellectuals, nor as naive as our so-called enlightened rulers. They sustain their dominion through meticulous, multifaceted studies of the nations they subjugate, studies designed to extinguish the seeds of resistance, to evade them, to suppress them. This is the very foundation upon which Orientalism was built, to serve colonialism from an academic standpoint, to extend its reach into the intellectual and educational spheres. Yet we, in our folly, revere the Orientalists with childlike simplicity, believing them to be saints of knowledge and wisdom, imagining in our naivete that they have severed all ties with their origins, that they have shed the very purpose for which they were first commissioned, especially when some among them artfully veil their deception with a kind word spoken about our faith, about our prophet, a bait designed to lull our thoughts into complacency, rendering our minds susceptible to their subtle insinuations in other domains. Indeed, one cannot help but laugh at times, though it is a laughter tinged with bitterness, when our so-called intellectuals pompously speak of the pure sincerity of the Orientalists. And should you dare to question the innocence of these saints, you are immediately branded as uncultured, or worse, as a fanatic who drags religion into every discussion. Once more we ask, who will rise among these dwarfs to convince them that they remain still nothing more than dwarfs? The English knew well that the armies of occupation would one day leave Egypt, whether sooner or later. It was inevitable. And so they could not rely solely on their military presence to uphold their hegemony. They, therefore, laid their foundations in the economic sphere, securing control over Egyptian markets while striving to close off global markets to Egyptian produce. They entrenched their influence in the financial domain, ensuring that our currency remained subservient to theirs, bound to their treasury, and so forth. Yet all these pillars of control would not have sufficed to maintain their dominion were it not for the deeper conquest, the conquest of the spirit and the intellect, a conquest that had been carefully nurtured throughout the past century and continues to receive their utmost attention even today. The white British administrators may have vacated their offices, but in their stead have risen the brown Englishmen, those Egyptians whose souls and minds have been colonized, fashioned by the very hands of their former overlords to serve their purposes. The British in particular paid great heed to the Ministry of Education, recognizing its pivotal role in shaping future generations. And so, even when they relinquished direct control over it to their native successors, they did so with serene confidence. For the entire system, its curricula, textbooks, teaching methods remained firmly aligned with the aims of intellectual and spiritual subjugation. It was a system that subtly yet persistently eroded the essence of religion, not merely excluding Islam from governance, but seeking to expunge it from life itself. Thus, generation after generation was raised under the shadow of occupation generations that continued to multiply under the stewardship of a mindset carefully cultivated by the colonial overseers of the Ministry of Education. These generations came to regard Islam as nothing more than a relic of backwardness and decline, believing that to shed its influence was to free oneself from the burden of ignorance and stagnation, an apparent sign of culture and liberation. Most insidious of all was the teaching of history in Egyptian schools, particularly the history of Islam. It was crafted with a cunning that only colonialism could devise, wielded as a weapon to sever the people from their own heritage, both the national and the spiritual. The secondary school student, and even the university graduate, emerges from years of study knowing little of the social vision of Islam, its humane outlook, its intellectual and ethical foundations. Instead, history is reduced to battles, wars, incidents and events, conveying the impression that Islam was nothing but a series of military campaigns, devoid of intellectual, social or humanitarian dimensions. Yet another force aided the colonial enterprise in distorting the true essence of Islam, one that was even more potent, more ruinous in its effect. It was none other than those whom people conventionally refer to as men of religion, the sheikhs and dervishes, who embodied intellectual stagnation and narrow-mindedness, or who propagated superstition and ignorance, all under the guise of religious devotion. They cloaked their absurdities in the garb of faith, making it appear grotesque, distorted and repellent. Worse still, their personal and social conduct was often marred by disgraceful misdeeds and vices, stripping religion of its dignity, its seriousness and the reverence it commands. And most grievous of all, they bartered away the verses of God for a paltry price, lending their voices in support of exploitation and tyranny, invoking Islam and the Quran to justify oppression. Thus, colonial education administered by the handcrafted agents of occupation who oversaw curricula, systems and textbooks worked hand in hand with these so-called religious figures to ensure that the occupation fulfilled its ultimate goal: to entrench the spiritual and intellectual servitude of the nation, even after the physical departure of colonial forces. To illustrate the precision with which the British safeguarded their hold over education, let us consider a recent, yet often overlooked example. The British knew of a man named Dr. Taha Hussein. He was already an established writer, a literary figure, and a university professor. Nothing about him had changed, except that he had now become the Minister of Education. The British also knew that his intellectual leanings, shaped by his education, inclined toward French thought. And so, when he assumed control of the Ministry of Education, they sensed a potential threat to English cultural influence. It was only then that they suddenly remembered that Dr. Taha Hussein was a great literary figure, worthy of an invitation to England, of being hosted by the British government and its academic institutions, of being showered with honorary titles from English universities. Only when he became Minister of Education did they deem him deserving of such honours. It was colonialism safeguarding its interests, fearful that the intricate web it had spun around the Ministry of Education might unravel or even tremble. Colonialism has always stood in fierce opposition to Islamic governance, and for an obvious reason. It is entirely logical. How could colonialism, which fights against Islamic belief even as a dormant force, allow that belief to manifest as a governing system? How could it permit Islam's spiritual strength to be transformed into a material force? The colonizers are not oblivious to our ignorance, nor are they blind to our heedlessness regarding the Quran's powerful injunction. And prepare against them whatever you can of power and of steeds of war, whereby you may terrify the enemy of God and your enemy. 860. They are fully aware that true Islamic governance would restore every mechanism of the state, its economic, military and educational institutions, to an Islamic framework, moulding society itself according to the principles of Islam. And there is nothing more perilous to both overt and covert colonialism than this. The colonizers also recognize that an Islamic state would establish justice in governance and fairness in the distribution of wealth, curbing both political tyranny and economic exploitation. This directly threatens colonial interests, for colonialism can only thrive when nations do not govern themselves. It is far easier to subjugate a people when power is concentrated in the hands of a select few, a ruling elite that, being small in number, is entirely dependent on colonial support for its survival. Such an elite governs through despotism and economic monopoly, ensuring that the masses remain subdued. In turn, colonialism hides behind this elite, rarely exposing its own face. There exists a natural alliance between colonialism and the dictatorship of power and wealth. Each depends upon the other, and both share a common interest. The very freedom and social justice that the colonizers enjoy in their own lands, they deny to the colonies and spheres of influence under their control, for they know that once these subjugated lands rid themselves of social oppression, they will stand face to face with their oppressors. Similarly, the exploiters within these lands do not wish to see the end of colonialism, for the day colonialism is eradicated, the masses will confront them as well. Since true Islamic governance is bound to establish absolute justice both in rule and in economic affairs, colonialism wages relentless war against it. This war is waged openly, through direct intervention, and covertly, through various disguises: the masks of tyrants and exploiters, the masks of so-called enlightened intellectuals, and the masks of those who oversee education, whether they realize their role or not. Colonialism may tolerate the existence of a false Islamic rule, one that arises in backward, ignorant lands and under oppressive, exploitative dictatorships, so that it may serve as a repugnant caricature, a deterrent against the very idea of Islamic governance and even against Islam itself. Then the chorus of the gullible and the insincere, the dwarves who seek to make themselves appear as something of consequence, rises in unison. Behold, this is Islamic rule. Do you not see how despotic, unjust, brutal, reckless, lustful and depraved it is? How backward, degraded and stagnant? And they proclaim that this is the living model of Islamic governance, the inevitable outcome of any religious rule upon the face of the earth, no matter its kind. And so these dwarfs rub their hands in glee, while the naive masses gather around them in bewildered simplicity. Meanwhile, the exploiters laugh at both the dwarfs and the masses, reassured that Islamic rule remains distant from them. And the colonizers laugh at all of them alike, for they are all ensnared within the same trap, struggling like feeble, despairing mice caught in a mousetrap. The enmity of tyrants and exploiters. We have already alluded to the inevitable clash between Islamic governance and the forces of tyranny and exploitation, unless, of course, Islam is reduced to a mere illusion devoid of tangible reality. But tyrants and exploiters can never rest assured that the masses will remain forever in a state of oblivion, nor can they be certain that, under the shade of an Islamic system, the people will not awaken and demand the true essence of Islam, rather than its mere outer shell. For when that day comes, the people will hold in their hands a mighty weapon, an irrefutable argument, and a powerful force that had once been used to lull them into complacency. Indeed, the exploiters and tyrants understand well that the masses are difficult to lead and subjugate when they are fighting for their faith. And so they pacify the people by granting them the husks of religion, its empty rituals and superstitions. But should religion become a living reality, a force that shapes life and society, then at that moment self-preservation and self-interest will drive them to resist it with all their might, for they and true Islamic governance dwell in separate valleys, never to meet. There is no harm in allowing Islam to exist as mere lip service, as the murmuring of prayer beads, as invocations and chants, as a ceremonial procession in which a camel carrying a holy relic is paraded 7 times, with its reins held in official hands, or as a festival in which fireworks are launched, as a Sufi order, or a noble lineage society where robes of honour are bestowed and titles conferred. All these are but instruments of sedation, wielded by tyrants and exploiters to distract the people. But when Islam becomes a serious system of governance, one that implements its laws in political and economic affairs, that grants every individual their due human, social and legal rights, that does not distinguish between acts of worship and legal ordinances, then, at that moment, Islam is regarded as a peril to be averted, a catastrophe to be repelled, a battle to be waged with all available means. At that moment, colonialism and exploitation stand united, their interests intertwined in resisting this impending danger, in blocking this looming threat, in stemming the tide that, if unleashed, would drown them both. It is then that these forces deem even communism a lesser threat, for nothing resists communism as effectively as Islamic justice. Communism, being an external adversary, can be fought with force and deception. But Islam is an internal force, bearing within it an argument that cannot be refuted through mere sophistry and deceit. Islam instills within the soul of the individual a sense of dignity and honour. It forbids submission to any governance that contradicts its principles. It grants a person confidence and pride before every authority, before every tyranny. This Islam is utterly incompatible with despotic rule. It does not allow autocrats to remain secure in their dominion. And Islam, which grants the state vast authority to regulate wealth and property, to redistribute resources for the welfare of society, to balance rents and wages, to nationalize public utilities, to eliminate monopolies, to prohibit usury and exploitative profits, this Islam is utterly incompatible with the interests of the wealthy elite, who cannot ensure their continued privilege under its rule. Thus, the tyrants and exploiters do not merely confront the call of Islam with fire and steel, they also unleash against it their professional clergymen, their hired writers, and their frivolous press, making it the target of mockery and derision. It becomes the subject of contempt and amusement for the shallow-minded journalists of Egypt, who find in it material for their idle entertainment, an amusement that befits their trivial thinking, their shallow knowledge, and their insignificance in any serious and dignified existence, such as the one Islam envisages. And what is truly strange is that even some serious intellectuals are swept away by this tide, influenced by the insidious propaganda of capitalist interests against Islam. They come to fear that Islamic governance will threaten their intellectual freedom, just as the loudspeakers of tyrants and exploiters would have them believe. Yet Islamic rule will never harm any upright thought, nor will it oppress any just cause. It is a battle only against injustice, against oppressive authorities, against the petty minds that thrive on hollow chatter and senseless prattle. And it is not a battle waged with fire and iron, as in the manner of tyrannical regimes, but rather with sound argument and the force of a living reality that leaves no room for empty babble, that finds no audience among the idle, for all are engaged in the earnest pursuit of life. The enmity of professional clergymen. Perhaps the strangest of all enmities toward Islamic governance is that of the professional clergymen, regardless of their sects, denominations, and schools of thought. Yet, in truth, this enmity is only strange in appearance. For they, more than anyone else, know that Islam recognizes no clergy, no class of men who live solely off their religious status without contributing anything of substance. In Islam, religion is not a profession except in the sense that it entails teaching, like any other branch of human knowledge, or adjudicating legal affairs, like any other specialized field. And they know well that Islam relentlessly pursues impostors, those who shroud its clarity with myths and superstitions, those who exploit its name to deceive the masses. For Islam is a faith of simplicity and clarity. It does not rely on miracles, mystical intercessions, or enigmatic supplications. It is built upon sound belief, righteous conduct, productive work, and earnest effort. If Islam were to govern, its first task would be to eradicate those who live in idleness, feeding off religion, to expose the charlatans who obscure its brilliance with murky legends, to denounce the deceivers who manipulate the minds of the people in its name, and to banish the mendicant dervishes who have no place in its order, no function in its state. And in Egypt their number is indeed vast, vast beyond measure. The professional clergy know well that they serve a fundamental function in feudal and capitalist societies, a function for which the state rewards them, and which society facilitates for them as a means of livelihood. That function is none other than the sedating and deceiving of the toiling, exploited and deprived masses. But when Islam governs, granting these masses their due rights, shielding them from the tyranny of exploiters and despots, and curbing the excessive wealth whose very existence wounds the souls of the destitute, what then becomes of these professional clergy? What is their place in such a society? What role do they play in such a state? What purpose do they serve among the people? The profession of religion is but a fragment of a flawed social order, an integral cog in its machinery of governance. But when these structures are set aright, when these mechanisms are purified, then the profession of religion loses both its demand and its necessity for religion itself, is no longer merely words and rituals, murmured phrases and chanted supplications, but rather a way of life, a system, a living society. This is a truth too glaring for these professionals to grasp with their minds and reason, yet one they instinctively perceive with their senses and intuition. And let us not doubt the intelligence of this class of people, for many among them possess great acumen, skill and dexterity. They wield their craft with the cunning of illusionists and the guile of sorcerers. Were they to live under a system that harnessed these talents for noble ends, society might well have reaped immense benefit from their abilities. But as it stands, they are but gears in the machinery of exploitation, themselves both its beneficiaries and its instruments. They are acutely aware of the perils of Islamic governance, the least of which is the redundancy of their parasitic function, which has no place in Islam. The enmity of the decadent and the degenerate. Egypt has descended into a state of moral decay, heedlessness and disease, a condition born of the social imbalance we have previously described, but also of the sweeping global currents that surged between the two great world wars. Wars, by their very nature, shake the foundations of society, sweeping before them all that is heedless and corrupt at the very least, by the sheer confrontation with danger and death, which drives men to snatch at whatever pleasures remain within their grasp, as dictated by primal instinct and necessity. Whatever the reasons, we have now reached a point where vice runs rampant, heedlessness floats to the surface, and moral decay permeates every aspect of life, whether in matters of sexuality, intoxicants, integrity, or the ethics of labour and conduct. These throngs of reckless and dissolute men and women are undoubtedly alarmed at the mere mention of Islam's legal bounds, those very bounds that instill terror in the hearts of the lewd and the shameless. Even its commands and prohibitions, which curb the whims of the soul and restrain transgressors, terrify them, for they would no longer be able to flaunt their debauchery with impunity, whether by custom or by law. Let us enter for a moment these scattered dens of idle women, the salons and gatherings, where frivolous minds, both young and old, engage in idle chatter, their empty lives steeped in vanity and indolence, which inevitably breed the most trivial of thoughts and deeds. I have already stated that no virtuous woman, engaged in her human endeavours within the bounds of honour and dignity, has anything to fear from Islam. But these particular dens know well that such a condition does not apply to them, for the vast and noble freedom Islam grants to women does not extend to the kind of activity they pursue. These crowds, men and women alike, young and old, who find no satisfaction in the noble and expansive freedom Islam offers to the virtuous, are terrified by the prospect of Islamic governance. It is a primal fear, an instinct of self-preservation, a desperate clinging to the security that the current social disorder provides them, a disorder rife with moral decay and imbalance. It is in their very nature to be enemies of an Islamic order, for they know it offers them no sanctuary. And these groups wield influence, they own clubs and newspapers, they exert authority over the mechanisms of governance and the institutions of society. Indeed, their influence surpasses that of any other force in this land. For theirs is the power that draws from the basest instincts of the body, the cravings of the flesh, the enticements of wealth and authority. And they wield all these forces in their battle against any system that would impose limits on their chaos and corruption. I still recall, years ago, the words of a certain minister of that era as he stood in a corridor of Parliament during a heated debate on the abolition of legalised brothels and the crackdown on clandestine prostitution. He uttered, "May no blessing be upon his body, nor wellness upon his health," the infamous words, "And where then are we supposed to go?" He followed this with a coarse, vulgar laugh, echoed by his lackeys and sycophants. Such ministers were many in Egypt, and so were their female counterparts. They call this unbridled animalism that pervades the land freedom. Some of them proclaim it progress and civilization, boasting with the unrestrained instincts of beasts. Others brand it artistic expression, for to them art is nothing but depravity, filthy, diseased, and obscene. As if art could not be the nourishment of a noble soul, the illumination of a dignified human spirit. I do not intend here to deliver a sermon, as the venerable scholars of religion have so often done. Rather, I seek only to point out that the decay of Egyptian society has reached its fullest, most putrid fruition, and that an Islamic government would not merely seek to prune away the rotten branches, but to uproot the very source of corruption, to purify the very soil in which it festers. And let it be known that much of the clamour against Islamic governance arises from the brothels, the dens of vice, and the carcasses floating atop this vast stagnant swamp in which not only thieves, drunkards, pimps and traffickers in flesh wade, but also men of high rank and households above suspicion. So when the people hear the uproar against Islamic rule and see the dwarfs leading the parade, let them know that the procession is not for those who wear the feathers, but for the vermin of the swamp vermin that fear the cleansing fire of purification. The enmity of communism and the communists. Communism is a movement that has suffered bitterly at the hands of the clergy, for it fought to overthrow the rule of the Tsars and to grant the masses the basic necessities of life they had long been denied. It is a philosophical doctrine that denies any influence in the course of history beyond material forces. From its very inception, it negates the existence of God, the one beyond all comparison. It asserts that all historical developments are driven solely by material conditions. From its very foundation, it denies the existence of divine messengers. It embraces the materialist interpretation of history. From its very premise, it rejects the idea that individuals, be they prophets or heroes, play any creative role in the evolution of society. And while in economic matters communism shares certain similarities with Islamic principles, it stands in stark contradiction to Islam's conception of the universe, life and humanity. It is therefore the fiercest of Islam's adversaries, for the two are fundamentally opposed in their very mode of thought. Communism sees itself as engaged in a perpetual struggle. Any ideology that acknowledges the spirit, that accounts for God and the hereafter, is deemed by communism an enemy, even if they share common ground in economic policies. Indeed, communism opposes Islam more vehemently than it does Christianity, for Christianity has ceased to be an active force in its path. Islam, on the other hand, possesses the power to achieve social and economic justice while still upholding faith in God and the divine reality of the soul. And this is the gravest danger of all to communism, for its very survival depends on the perpetuation of social misery and the hopelessness of the masses, on the illusion that no path to justice exists, but through its own doctrines. And communism has felt this in recent years. Thus, it has begun to marshal its efforts to combat the call for Islamic governance and to propagate its campaign against this idea. This campaign takes two distinct paths. The first path, it seeks to distort the image of Islamic rule, exploiting the false portrayal of Islamic governance in some Eastern nations. It sets out to demonstrate the supposed lack of seriousness in this system, the ambiguity of its foundational principles, and the suitability of such ambiguity for misinterpretation and exploitation against the masses, against freedom, and against independent thinkers. The second path, it persistently argues that the world is divided into only two blocks, the Eastern and the Western, and that any inclination toward the Eastern camp necessarily strengthens the Western camp. Furthermore, any thought of establishing a third bloc is dismissed as a fragmentation of forces, which would ultimately strengthen the capitalist front. Yet we have laid bare the fallacy inherent in both these claims and the hidden motives concealed behind them. What matters is that people remain vigilant when they hear arguments against Islamic governance, so they may discern the true intent behind such rhetoric. Communists are fanatically devoted to their ideology, a fanaticism that transforms it, in their eyes, from a mere means to achieve social justice into an end in itself. Consequently, they are keen to obstruct any alternative path that might lead the masses to genuine justice, so that no road remains open except the road to communism. We must not overlook the fact that it is not merely ideological fanaticism that dictates the strategy of communist propagandists. The Russian state, too, has its own stake in this matter. Communism serves as a means of control over any nation that embraces it. Mere adherence to communism is not enough unless that nation also submits to Russian influence. Look at Yugoslavia, a communist country whose adherence to communism is beyond question, yet when it dared to lift its head in defiance of that influence, it was cast into the abyss of condemnation, and its communism did not avail it in the least. In Egypt, additional factors come into play beyond communist fanaticism, and these factors must be taken into account. There are communists in Egypt not because they love communism, but because they hate Islam. Thus, anything that opposes Islam becomes, in their eyes, a friend. They feign before the gullible among Muslims that they are devoid of all religious bias and that they disregard all faiths. Yet, in truth, they are crusaders whose enmity is directed against Islam alone. And when they meet those who believe, they say, "We believe." But when they are alone with their evil ones, they say, "Verily, we are with you, we were only mocking." Quran 2:14. I do not wish to dwell excessively on this matter, but I do wish to alert every unsuspecting Muslim who may be misled by this conspiracy to examine closely the true motivations behind the attacks on Islam and Islamic governance. Communism may well be nothing more than a mere facade for this insidious assault, and I would urge every Muslim youth whose steps have strayed into a communist cell to look around him. If he finds among his comrades any of these covert crusaders, let him beware, for he is not engaged in a cause for communism or social justice, but rather in a cause for the crusaders and their designs. I had intended to conclude here, were it not for a thought that lingers in my mind regarding some of our dear Egyptian communists, who at times speak against Islamic governance. The majority of these dear comrades engage in such discussions while they are enveloped in the intoxicating haze of hashish, with glowing embers of coal before them, and the sinuous smoke of the water pipe curling around them. These comfortable comrades have no desire to confront the harsh realities of the world, and we pity them, for they are but innocent victims of this painful reality. They flee from it into the delirium of hashish, dreaming sweet dreams of Papa Stalin, who, from his tree of gifts, bestows upon them a delectable social justice requiring no effort even to partake of it. Why then should they concern themselves with this arduous Islam, which demands struggle and toil, which imposes upon them vigilance and labour? Leave us be, my friend, spare us this Islam and its weighty burdens. Tomorrow we shall awaken from our slumber to the sound of the mighty steps of Stalin the Magnificent. And now, O masses, now the deprived, the oppressed, the downtrodden must take their destiny into their own hands. They must contemplate the means of deliverance and make their choice. No one shall extend aid to these masses except themselves. They must concern themselves with their own affairs and look not to salvation from another quarter. Neither the parties that govern, whether collectively or individually, nor the partisan or non-partisan press, nor the United Nations or any of its capitalist states, nor even communism itself in the end, none of these will stretch out a hand to help the toiling masses of Egypt unless those very masses extend their own hands to their cause. A mere glance at the nature of these institutions and their realities suffices to convince anyone who seeks conviction that reliance on any of them for the cause of the masses is nothing but self-delusion, heedlessness and negligence. And these political formations, whom do they represent? Certainly not the masses, neither in their mentality, nor in their interests, nor in their circumstances. Who are those whom the law requires to be senators in Parliament? They are those who possess a certain financial threshold. Is there even a single individual among the millions of impoverished masses who meets these criteria? And who are those who can afford to be elected as representatives in Parliament? They are those who can first pay the deposit of £150. Then they must also possess the means to spend thousands of pounds on the electoral battle, on its brokers, its banquets, its travels, its feasts, and all its extravagances. Then they must also be able to connect with a political party that nominates them, supports them, and demands from them a financial contribution to its treasury, ranging from hundreds to thousands of pounds. Is there anyone among the toiling masses who meets these conditions? No. Furthermore, the impoverished and exploited masses lack strong organizational structures, unions and federations to manage the electoral contest with their resources and influence, so that they might send representatives from among their own ranks to the Parliament, voices that would articulate their pain and aspirations. Thus, the impoverished, deprived and oppressed masses remain on one side, while the political and parliamentary formations remain on another. The struggle between conflicting interests persists until the masses take their own affairs into their own hands, establishing institutions capable of securing victory in electoral and non-electoral battles alike. Until that day arrives, the masses must place no hope in the ongoing partisan struggle, nor should they look to one party over another, nor expect justice from the ascension of any party to power, whether by election or otherwise. This truth is affirmed by every past experience of parliamentary and partisan politics in Egypt over the past quarter century. Never once has this partisan struggle been waged for the benefit of the masses. It has always been about seizing the reins of power and securing its spoils, about gratifying and enriching sycophants, cronies, relatives and in-laws. But when even the faintest shadow of a threat looms over a minor interest of the capitalist elite, the warring factions forget their enmities, the adversaries lay aside their disputes, and all stand united in a single front against this insignificant threat, the Wafdists, the Sadists, the Constitutionalists, all alike, defending the threatened interests of capitalism against the rights of the deprived masses. And whosoever doubts this evident truth need only return to the records of Parliament when deliberating upon the Progressive Tax Bill, the Extraordinary Profits Tax, the Inheritance Tax or the Labour Unions Bill, particularly the matter of depriving domestic workers of the right to form unions, or any proposal that seeks to impose upon capitalists even a fraction of the burdens borne by capital in every corner of the world except in the land of feudalism. He will find that the opponents are not representing their parties or institutions, but rather themselves and the interests of their own class, for they are all capitalists before they are Wafdists, Sadists, or constitutionalists. And here we stand before an example so near and so palpable that every soul in this nation perceives it, for it is a bitter draught we are all forced to swallow. It is a raging fire in which we are all scorched. Behold, we stand before the monstrous spectre of soaring prices, an insatiable beast that gapes wide its jaws to consume both the green and the dry, draining the lifeblood of millions with a savage greed, so that the veins of the wealthy may swell and their bellies grow distended with excess. And what has the state done? What has Parliament undertaken to subdue this ravenous beast? Declarations and speeches, then more declarations and more speeches. At most, a handful of inspection campaigns in the markets. But these markets are here, in Cairo, where only the final link in the long chain of rising prices is visible. The source of this inflation lies not here, but elsewhere, and those who hold power know this well. Yet they dare not lay a hand upon that source, for they are its very representatives, its beneficiaries, its partners in profit. Our sustenance and our goods come from two origins, one domestic from what we cultivate, raise and produce within our own land, and the other foreign from what we import of food, manufactures, tools and raw materials. The state knows full well that landlords lease a single fedan at 50, 60, even £80. What then can be expected but that the prices of crops harvested from this land should soar, that the cost of livestock grazing upon it should rise, that the prices of their dairy products should follow suit? What use is it then to combat inflation here in Cairo, while leaving its true source unchecked, allowing it to swell and intensify into a raging fire? The solution is clear and within reach. The state must take control over exports and imports. It must purchase, on behalf of the nation, all agricultural products destined for foreign markets above all, cotton at a price that fairly compensates the farmers. Then, it must sell these commodities abroad at global market rates. As for the surplus revenue generated by this difference in price, it should be used to offset the cost of imported goods, ensuring they reach the consumer at reduced prices. This would bridge the gap between the high cost of state purchases and the fair prices at which they should be sold to the masses. Only then, only after such measures, will price controls and market inspections bear fruit. But who shall implement this? Would a government of capitalists and a parliament of capitalists take such a step? And for whose sake? For the sake of the masses, for the welfare of the people. And what of the long-neglected projects that languish endlessly while the national wealth crumbles, individual incomes decline, and the unemployed crowd the length and breadth of the valley? Why are these projects left unrealized? Because their execution requires money, and the money lies in the pockets of the wealthy, and the wealthy sit in the ministries and in the parliament. Meanwhile, the masses cry out, "Down with this! Long live that!" while the illusionists distract them with talk of evacuation and unity. And the colonial powers remain unconcerned by this outcry, for they know well that such slogans are crafted for internal consumption alone. Their vital interests remain safeguarded not by occupying armies, but by the natural allegiance between them and the forces of capital. What does it matter to them if the masses shout until their throats are raw, so long as these masses hold no real power over their own destiny? And those who do wield power are determined to preserve the status quo. For it serves as their bulwark against the people, against the moment when the people, at last, free themselves from these distractions and turn their full attention toward the pursuit of social justice. It is naivety, nay, it is sheer folly that leads the masses in Egypt to believe that any political party in this land truly desires, with genuine intent, the evacuation of foreign forces, the realization of national unity, or the resolution of the Egyptian question upon a foundation that would expel colonial influence and diminish imperial power. For all these parties know full well that this Egyptian question is nothing but their instrument of trade, the tool with which they manipulate the scene. Beyond this, they recognize that colonialism itself is their last line of defense, the final rampart shielding the fundamental interests they represent. The only differences between them lie in the methods by which they address the masses. A man like Sidki did not conceal his eagerness to bind Egypt to the imperial wheel through mutual defense agreements, for he understood well who his natural allies were, the same allies of the industrial federation which he once led. As for the others, they may well raise their voices with the people, chanting, "Down with colonialism," either to lull the masses into complacency or to drive them to exhaustion with ceaseless cries for the so-called freedom fighters. They do so in reliance upon the ignorance of the simple folk, trusting that the masses will fail to perceive the natural alliance between the true interests of colonialism in this land and the vested interests that all parties, without exception, uphold. And what of the press? It is in no position to stand with the people against the oppressors and exploiters, nor against colonialism and the mighty forces of global capitalism that stand behind it. For a newspaper is, above all, a commercial enterprise. It must at least balance its budget to survive. And competition in the press industry has become fierce within the narrow circle of available readers. This competition demands ever-increasing investments in quality, rising costs, and substantial financial resources. A newspaper cannot reduce its expenses by increasing circulation. Rather, the losses only grow if it relies on sales alone. The cost of producing a single copy of any newspaper, whether daily or weekly, far exceeds the price at which it is sold in the market. This is an irrefutable truth that must be recognized, so that the struggling, impoverished masses may understand that it is not their pennies and small coins that finance the popular newspapers they read. These newspapers depend on other sources for their survival and profit. First and foremost, they rely on advertising. And these advertisements are controlled by powerful capitalist enterprises, which in turn serve the interests of the very corporations that fund them. Secondly, they rely on secret financial allocations, whether temporary or permanent. The temporary ones come from ministries that fund their partisan newspapers, or from governments seeking to buy influence or secure neutrality, and such payments are typically substantial. The permanent ones are dispersed by the state's press administration, ensuring that journalists across successive regimes remain on government payrolls, serving persistent state interests that transcend party politics. Thirdly, they rely on the covert funding of international intelligence networks, particularly those of Britain and America. Beyond this, there are direct propaganda budgets allocated by corporations, business houses, and various organizations. It is these financial sources that compensate for the gap between the cost of printing a newspaper and its retail price. They are what enable newspapers to acquire vast printing presses, erect grand headquarters, and finance extensive promotional campaigns. Thus, if a newspaper were to rely solely on sales revenue, increasing circulation would only amplify its financial losses rather than generate profit. The sole benefit of higher sales is an indirect one. It raises advertising rates and enhances the newspaper's value in the shadowy world of secret funding, be it domestic or foreign. This, and only this, is the true measure of a newspaper's popularity. Once we grasp this reality, we understand why the press cannot stand with the people. It offers them only what their pennies and dimes can buy, while reserving its true allegiance for its real patrons, the capitalists, the governments, and the foreign intelligence agencies. Between these two masters, the press divides its efforts with a cunning precision that matches the ignorance of the masses on one hand and the sharp acumen of the other. But as for the press of opinion, which strives solely for the toiling masses, it stands ever persecuted by the state, by local and global capitalism, by all the forces of imperialism alike. And then, as if that were not enough, it finds itself pursued even by the very masses it seeks to serve, those naive multitudes whose limited resources cannot sustain the dazzling spectacle of grand journalism, and whose awakened conscience will not permit them to indulge in alluring images of beauty and seduction, nor to be lulled into a stupor by idle chatter and frivolous amusement. Thus, the masses turn away from it, refusing it even their meagre pence and farthings, while the other press thrives, fortified by the ceaseless flow of pounds and dollars from the other side. Indeed, the alluring images and the seductive charms are but the diversions with which the capitalist press preoccupies the deprived multitudes, lest they awaken to the brazen pleasures of the capitalists themselves, who revel not in images, but in the very substance of such beauty and seduction. And the empty chatter that fills page upon page, this is the opiate with which these newspapers steal the effort and attention of the reader, distracting him from his own misery and deprivation. For none may serve capitalism as effectively as those who employ these two vile instruments, tools embraced by the foolish masses with the same eagerness with which they embrace hashish and opium. And now the capitalists bring glad tidings to the deprived masses, tidings of the noble efforts of the United Nations in the struggle against poverty, of the earnest social studies conducted under its patronage to examine the afflictions of the people, of the famous Point 4 in Truman's grand program. What then do the deniers of this land seek? This ungrateful land which knows not virtue and offers no thanks for the favours bestowed upon it. As for the capitalists of this land, they are eager to reap the benefits of these United Nations efforts. They delight in these solemn social studies, making much of their findings in the newspapers, occupying the people's minds for days and weeks on end. For is this not, too, one of the most effective means of distracting the multitudes, lulling them into complacency, soothing them into slumber for a while? And their newspapers ceaselessly inscribe in bold letters those grandiose reports of the tender concern shown by international organizations, their profound interest in the cause of social justice in Egypt. Is this not indeed a most ingenious method of winning the hearts of the masses for imperialism, of shifting their burdens onto its shoulders, entrusting it with the realization of that social justice which they long for yet never behold? But the masses must come to understand that there exists an unbreakable bond of common interest between the world's capitalists, a natural alliance binding their representatives in both East and West against the people and against the people's interests. And they must awaken to the truth that a shared interest likewise unites imperialism with local capitalism in a strong and deeply rooted pact. The people must grasp that imperialism has no desire to confront the masses with its own grim visage. It must have a veil behind which to rule, an instrument through which to execute its designs, a safeguard through which to secure its interests. And this veil is none other than the ruling capitalist class, to whom it entrusts the reins of power and in whose hands it finds its own tranquility. It is inconceivable that imperialism would wage war against this class, or that this class would oppose it to the point of its own destruction or enfeeblement, at which the masses might finally prevail. The people must learn that from its very advent, imperialism has laboured to establish this class, that the traitors who paved its way, who betrayed or deceived the Egyptian army, were showered with its favours and granted dominion over the land. And today their descendants, those lords of grand estates, those towering figures of wealth, are exalted in this unfortunate land as the illustrious houses of noble lineage. Finally, the masses must comprehend that imperialism is intent upon their starvation. For it knows well, as its emissary, George Lloyd, once confessed in his book, that it was the prosperity of 1919 that emboldened the Egyptian people to rise in revolution. Thus, the people of Egypt must be kept in hunger, lest they awaken from the pursuit of their daily bread and turn once more to revolution against imperialism. And then there remains communism, that dream of the indolent in Egypt, who, amid the narcotic haze of hashish and its sweet lethargy, whisper to themselves, "There is no hope. Let us await salvation at the hands of Papa Stalin." True, capitalism will resist every call for social justice, combating it with force and guile, with wealth and the purchase of loyalties, with the deception of the masses. All of this is true. But tell me when, in the history of this world, has a single cause triumphed without a struggle, be it short or long? Nations that do not fight for their freedom shall never deserve to be free. And if we were to sit, complacent and at ease, smoking our hashish and dreaming our idle dreams, then even if communism were to come, it would find us as nothing more than wretched, servile creatures, fit only to be ruled as slaves. For human dignity alone demands that we rise to action, that we earn our liberation and our freedom, else we shall pass merely from one form of servitude to another. Its name may change, its masters may differ, but the slaves shall remain slaves. And now, O masses, it has become clear that no hand shall be extended to lift you up unless you first extend your own, and that all paths lead only to further illusions, save for your one true and original path, O masses, The path of human dignity has been laid before you, the path of social justice, the path of that glory which once belonged to the Muslim nation and which it may yet reclaim, if only it awakens. O masses, behold, Islam stands before you, ready to answer the call of all who yearn for honor, for ascendancy, for sovereignty, ready to embrace all who seek equality, freedom and justice, ready for all who believe in themselves, in their people, in their land, ready for all who feel that they too have a noble place in this existence. O masses, this is the path, this is the path.